Jason X, The Experiment, Chapter 17, Part 2. "Are you waiting for Dr. Gottman, Walona?" Omar Wing asked politely. The intern sitting on the stool by the counter looked up from the magazine she was reading on her tablet and shrugged one shoulder listlessly. "Not exactly. I mean, technically, yeah. But if you want to know the truth, he pretty much took the day off." Wing nodded, frowning slightly. "Did he say why?" "Not to me. He might have said something to Ondine, though." "Oh?" Wing's frown deepened. "He originally assigned her to babysit his cells, but then she had to go see Dr. Toot and Dr. Zai, so she asked me to fill in for her." "Has either of you told Dr. Gottman what you're doing?" Walona's half-smile was wry and knowing. "Dr. Gottman told her he doesn't want to be disturbed even if the sun goes nova. I guess he's in a pretty bad mood about something." "Who says there's no God?" Wing muttered under his breath with a chuckle. "Pardon? Nothing. You mind if I take a look at these cells you're babysitting?" "I don't, but I can't speak for anyone else." She gestured at an incubator unit a couple of feet away from her on the counter. "Pretty weird cells, I gotta tell you." Wing popped up the screen on top of the unit. For a long moment he just stared at the image on the display and then turned to Walona again. "When was the last time you checked this out yourself?" "About 2 minutes before you got here." "Well, I hate to tell you this, but either this screen isn't working right, or somebody's playing a joke on you with these so-called cells." She slipped down off the stool and went over to look at the screen. "No, everything's fine. I thought the same thing when Ondine showed me the setup, but that's the way everything's supposed to be. If you don't believe me, which I can tell you don't, play back the log and see for yourself." She pointed at the console on the desk in the center of the room. Wing reviewed the previous 3 hours backwards and forwards at varying rates of speed, more out of simple, fascinated disbelief than a need for meticulous verification of what he was seeing. "Have you seen this?" he asked Walona finally. She looked up from the tablet again and nodded. "And you didn't think there was anything odd about these cells?" "Sure I did. They're chimeras, right?" Wing hesitated. "What makes you say that?" "You think they're hybrids or mules?" "I think they're impossible." "Yeah?" Walina gave a wry laugh and gestured at the incubator. "Tell them that." "Nobody's ever been able to cross organic and inorganic matter and produce something viable. It won't work, even with dead organic matter. The stuff rots." "Preaching to the choir, Doc." Wing frowned at her. "Pardon?" "Sorry, just a dumb old cliche I caught from somebody. Means I agree completely." Walona sighed as she shifted position on the stool and crossed her legs. "Believe me, I checked every way I could, short of canceling the procedure and starting over. And I would have done that even if it meant putting everybody's ass in a noose, mine and Ondine's as well as GG's, except I don't know where the original smear came from." She paused, her expression becoming more troubled. "Although, truth to tell, I've got a pretty good idea." "Oh, yeah?" "Yeah, I piped in some extra capacity so I could check for the presence of any DNA, even if it was just a trace. I kept it non-invasive so I wasn't really hoping for much, but I found enough to identify." "And whose is it?" asked Wing. "Nobody we know, which means it has to belong to that creature Stein's got hidden." Wing raised one eyebrow skeptically. "It's a little late for her to try hiding something everybody knows about." "What she's got isolated, then? She's got 3 adjoining isolation cells locked down, contents unregistered and inaccessible, and yeah, she can get away with that," Walona added, seeing the look on his face. "Nobody else can, just her." "The 3 interns?" "Yeah, I thought of them too," she said. 3 interns, 3 isolation cells, which is why I was checking the DNA in the first place. It's not from any of the sex maniacs. If she's got them in isolation, the only thing she's done to them so far is make them celibate. "I'll be very surprised if she stops there," Wing murmured, mostly to himself. "Choir," Walona said. "You want me to do anything?" Wing shook his head. "Not right at the moment. As a matter of fact, I've got some work to do in here, and it's going to take me a while. Why don't you check with Supreme Allah? See if he's got somebody desperate for a little help. I can keep an eye on this. If you see Ondine before I do, tell her I'll square everything with Gunner." She thanked him and left. taking her tablet with her. "Oh, no, Walona, thank you," he murmured, turning back to the impossible cells. The disadvantage of using the isolation cells as her base, Stein thought, as she unpacked the first of the 2 cases she had brought in, was having to do so much herself. At least she could use that moron Newman or Nin as a pack animal, and now that he was in service to her exclusively, she didn't have to worry about him running his mouth around any of his grunt pals and accidentally letting something slip, or accidentally hearing some rumor about Linda that might have disturbed him. Nin could do a lot of the heavy lifting and hauling for her, but she had to take care of a lot of the scut work, like cleaning all by herself. She couldn't have him cleaning up blood and fragments of tissue and still expect him to believe that those 3 interns were just sitting safe and untouched in solitary confinement, even though he hadn't seen her bring in any skin bags from the cloning area. Even his stupidity had its limits. Despite the tedium, though, cleaning wasn't so bad. She had thought it would take forever to mop up Linda Newman's remains, and she had managed to get that done in good time. Even sealing the blood-stained breakage from disposal in proper hazmat receptacles hadn't taken as long as she had thought it would. The detail of grunts had collected and removed the stuff without question or comment, just like they did with any hazardous materials. Today she was going back into his skull, which alone called for 3 neutralizers just to keep all the tissue permeable. His body had the capacity to learn and adapt on a subcellular level. Every time she made an incision, it would heal slightly faster, and it became that much more difficult to repeat the same procedure later. The time would come, she knew, when the neutralizers wouldn't be able to counteract the defenses set up by the nanos in his system. When that happened, she wouldn't be able to cut him open with a power saw the size of a planet. If she didn't come up with a way to get around that soon, she was going to find herself permanently locked out of this magnificent creature. The idea had come to her while she had been cleaning up the last of what she had kept of Linda Newman. There had just been enough skin and bone to try grafting some onto the creature. No luck at all. At first, Newman, or Nin, cells would seem to take, settling right into the creature's tissue. Then the creature's tissue would eradicate it, breaking it down so that she couldn't detect any residue, even on the sub-molecular level. Exactly why this had caused her mind to leap to the idea of reprogramming the nanos in situ was unclear to her. Not that it was something she really cared to agonize over. For that matter, reprogramming wasn't quite the right word. It was more like retuning, making a few modifications that weren't designed to contradict their original functions. Just give her a little control over them, as and when. Adding her own nanos had been a waste of time. The creature's own mechanisms had automatically absorbed them, presumably using the extra material to reproduce. The thing to do, she decided, was to focus Control Central in the only thing that the creature was short on, higher brain function. There was some gray matter, but less than she had ever seen in the skull of any human, and not even enough for her to make a vague guess as to how it might be organized. The nano mechanisms obviously hadn't been programmed to make any enhancements there. But if there was more of it, there was a good chance that they would adapt and learn how to respond to it, even take orders from it. Of course, considering the creature's size and the multitude of nanos it contained, it would probably take a lot more than the average amount of gray matter. She moved to the second case, which was an oversized cooler, and touched the front with a fingertip. It de-opaqued instantly, showing her each brain afloat in each of the 3 fluid-filled compartments. She was more interested in what it said on the tablets they were wired into. According to the readings, they were still in a state of REM sleep. Stein smiled. So far, so good. She could count on at least another 30 minutes before they had to be reset. That was fine with her. Let them dream while they could. She picked up a couple of neutralizers and turned to the creature on the operating table. "I'd make a witty comment," she told him, "but I think I'll wait till later, when you can actually appreciate it." Of everything that had ever happened to him, of everything anyone had ever done to him, this was the worst, and he could remember it all. Not the same way people, the loathsome living, remembered what they called the past. Not as what had been, but as what he was. Everything that had ever happened to him, everything that anyone had ever done to Jason Voorhees, was Jason Voorhees, always. Even back in the spaceship, when the nanos had flooded into him and taken over the regeneration process, picking up all the pieces and putting them back together in an improved and enhanced state, he had remained Jason Voorhees. Even when they had rebuilt him again from the charred fragment and the muck at the bottom of the lake, he was still Jason Voorhees. And even now, with his head split open and this woman packing this living tissue, this garbage into his skull, he was still Jason Voorhees, still anti-life. But in spite of his fury at this violation, the mechanisms inside of him remained inert. He knew there was some kind of force at work that interfered with them and paralyzed them, which in turn paralyzed him. And somehow the woman was doing it, the same way she was changing something in the composition of his body so she could cut into him. But both his body and the mechanisms were adapting, evolving to counter her instruments and tools. So she would have to change the settings, make them stronger, or make new devices. Eventually, she would run out of settings, and none of her devices would have any effect on him. That was inevitable. She seemed perfectly content to ignore this, to go on doing whatever it was she did as if she were always going to be more powerful than he was. It made no difference, though. What she knew about him, what she thought she knew about him, what she wished or hoped she was going to find out about him. He would simply wait for the time when he could finally just reach out and put a stop to her and her life. It was what he was. But now she was forcing pieces of life into him. The fury inside of him should have overcome anything, everything at work on him. His rage should have broken his restraints and put her skull in his hands. Abruptly, he felt the surface he was lying on tilting forward, raising him up almost to a standing position. The woman moved around to stand in front of him. "I'm going to leave the transplanted material hooked up to life support for another hour. Then we'll see how the graft between your brain and the new tissue is progressing." She gave him a long, searching gaze as she stripped off her gloves one at a time and dropped them on the floor. "Work with me on this." The insult of the living matter pressed into him. Chapter 18. "Where's Dr. Gold?" Lynn asked, hoping the question came off as politely interested rather than nosy or impertinent. "He didn't deign to tell me," Omar Wing replied as he set a small white insulated box. "Cool, Carrie, it's your lunch," the slightly faded red lettering across the side exclaimed, onto the workbench. "But whatever it is, it probably won't cheer him up either," he winked, which jerked a startled laugh out of her. "I'm sorry," she said, putting a hand over her mouth briefly. "I didn't know if he looked that way to me just because I'm new." "No, it's not just you," Wing said genuinely. "He looks suicidal to everyone. You get used to it after you've been here a while. But you never stop noticing." "I'm sorry," Lynn said again. "I really shouldn't laugh." She was trying not to, but now that she had started, she was finding it somewhat difficult to stop. Wing gave her a mock solemn look. "Maybe not, but if you don't, your face might freeze like that, too." She covered her mouth again, laughing harder. I'm sorry, she said when she could finally speak. "Stop apologizing," he told her. "You haven't done anything wrong yet." He paused and his gaze fell on the stasis chambers she had filled the day before. "Who are those from?" Her laughter dried up almost instantly. "The soldiers in quarantine. Dr. Gold took them before the virus showed itself. Dr. Haddad O'Reilly scanned them, and they're not infected." "Weird." He turned to look at her speculatively. "Doesn't that strike you as weird?" "About as weird as Dr. Gottman insisting that I was the infecting agent," Lynn said honestly. "I don't see how I could have gotten in carrying a virus without it being detected." "Well, there are viruses, and there are viruses." Wing grabbed an empty tray from a cabinet under the counter and began putting the stasis chambers on it, waving her back when she went to help him. "We're starting to see dormant forms like nothing we've seen before. You could almost swear that somebody's teaching them encryption." He finished loading the tray and set it down at the far end of the counter. "And while we're on the subject of unprecedented, I've got a little change to our regularly scheduled day in the cloning lab." "I had a feeling that wasn't really your lunch," Lynn said as he opened the box. "And you're right." Wing lifted a small round covered dish out of the box with both hands. "Do you know why this is called a petri dish?" he asked her. Lynn shook her head. "Me neither. It's one of those silly things from Prevac Earth where the name survived but the story behind it seems to be lost. Stuff like that drives me crazy." "What is it?" Lynn asked. She could see something that looked like a small section of black spiderweb in the center of the dish. "I'm going to cultivate it and find out." He jerked his chin towards the vat area. "Open number 5 for me, will you?" Number 5 was right next to the one that had contained the boy. She had been immensely relieved when she had come in and seen that Gold had been telling her the truth yesterday. Or at least mostly the truth. The adult male occupying the vat may not have had the child's prettiness, but he was far from unattractive. Not hard to look at, which was why she still found him hard to look at, even if not quite as hard to look at as a child. She kept her back to the vat as she prepped the vacant one for Wing, hoping that when she came in tomorrow he'd be gone. "And then you'll just have to look at another one," she thought, as Wing placed the dish in a circular recess in the bed. "Or 2, or more." "You can close it now," he said, nodding at the control panel on her left. Lynn did so, watching as the curved transparent cover slid up from the foot of the vat. As soon as it locked itself into place, Lynn was amazed to see the top of the petri dish begin to vanish, as if something were eating it away from the center. "Usually this stuff's not very exciting to watch, unless you're entertained by watching paint dry," Wing said. "Usually?" Lynn asked. "You think this might be different because you don't know what it is?" "I've set up extra continuous monitoring." He pointed at the ceiling directly above the vat. "Just in case." "Doesn't the vat have a real time log as well?" Wing nodded. "I want pictures that are already pictures, not just reams of data that I have to reformat. I don't have anything else for you here, so you might as well go back to Supreme Allah and see who he's not got begging for help today." He moved around the end of the vat and then paused, looking down at the mature male and the one next to it. "LeBlanc, we hardly knew you." "That's LeBlanc?" Lynn blurted, looking from the clone to Wing and back again several times. "LeBlanc's clone, yes," Wing said. "But I thought he was gone." Lynn took a step back from the thing, feeling more disconcerted than ever without really knowing why. "Yes, but he left his tissue samples behind. We all have tissue samples on file here," Wing frowned. "Didn't they take any from you yet?" "Just some blood." She put a hand over the crook of her arm. "And only because Dr. Gottman thought I was patient 0. "Well, they'll get around to it, I'm sure." "What do they plan to do with it?" she asked, following him back to the other part of the lab. He shrugged. "That's up to Dr. Stein." "But I thought it was against the law to clone someone in their absence, even as a skin bag, except where there's an imminent loss of life." "Dr. Stein has a dispensation, but only for civilians. The military wouldn't go so far as to let her cultivate cells from any of their personnel. Unless, of course, they're dead. Then she can do what she wants." "But what if—" Wing interrupted her with a heavy sigh. "Come on now. I know you're new, but I didn't think you were fresh out of Petri dish yourself. Dr. Stein does whatever she feels is necessary. Now, like I said, get back to Supreme Allah and pick up another assignment. We're short-handed, remember?" Dr. Stein looked up from the 3 corpses stacked on the morgue trays to the mess she had found when she had opened up the specimen's skull. Very disheartening, this. Now she had to write off 3 interns, and God only knew how long it was going to take to get replacements for them. Then the replacements would have to be trained, which would take even more time. It seemed to her as if the whole project had suddenly taken the wrong turn and gone off course, so that it was no longer heading for a successful conclusion, but a state of complete chaos. That happened sometimes, she knew. Not to Dr. Stein, of course. It never, ever happened to her, because whenever she embarked on any sort of project, she always made sure that she had virtual total control over everything in it and around it. All her decisions were final. Her word was law. No appeal, no reprieve, and no arguments. Now, if only the personnel could have been handled the same way. Assistants that could have been stored like instruments and tissue samples when not in use. When she did need them, she could have just pressed a button to wake them up, programmed them to do what they were supposed to, and then, when they had carried out their task, all she would have to do was deactivate them and put them away till the next time she needed them. Nothing to do with them now but sample their tissue and grow a few skin bags. That didn't replace the interns, but at least it would provide some more organs for later experiments. You could never have too many spare organs in Dr. Stein's experience. But damn it, this should have worked, she thought stubbornly. The internal nanos plus the specimen's own auto-regeneration should have combined to modify the transplanted brain tissue and produce an organ that would give the creature enough higher brain function so that she would be able to communicate with it. Instead, the creature's body had completely overwhelmed and consumed the donor brain matter. As near as she could tell, anything that had not simply been absorbed into the creature's body had been covered to the viscous ooze that served as blood, and then expelled through any convenient channel. Black gunk dribbled out of the specimen's ears and dripped from the edges of the mask-like face. Well, at least she knew now one thing for certain. There was absolutely no possibility of foreign tissue surviving inside this creature. Stein closed the creature's skull and prepared to take tissue samples from the dead interns for cultivation in the clone lab. Just as she uncovered the first one, her gaze came to rest on what was left of his cranium, and she had an inspiration. Just because the specimen was a lousy host didn't mean that its material couldn't be hosted by another body. In particular, one of these bodies. Quickly, and she inspected their heads and decided the one named Cray was in the best condition. She swiveled his tray out and positioned him side by side with her specimen. She started to prepare a tray of surgical instruments and paused. Opening her specimen's head up all over again was not detrimental to his condition, since absolutely nothing interfered with the regenerative process. The problem was that after each regeneration, she had to retune and strengthen the field that kept him immobile. It was as if all the nanos in his body underwent a special kind of change in response to this regenerative activity. More than that, each change seemed to be building on the one that had occurred before, as if they were following the particular steps of a process. But every time she tried to examine the process and identify at least one or two of its elements, she could find no tangible evidence in the nanos themselves. Individually, they had not changed at all. It was only their behavior in groups that had altered, but she could find no reason for it. Unless, of course, she wanted to give herself over completely to the fantasies of clinical paranoia. Then she could explain everything very easily. The specimen's body was possessed by a force that could not only convert the nanos for its own purposes, but was also capable of concealing the exact nature of the process. Standing between the specimen on the table and the corpse on the morgue tray, she replayed her thoughts and suddenly felt herself seized by a weariness so intense that she was tempted to stretch out on the counter and go to sleep. Instead, she left the morgue tray where it was, checked to make sure that the specimen was adequately restrained, and then went to the unoccupied isolation cell next door. The nano repair bed had been recently installed, and its reservoirs freshly charged with new medical nanos. Stein set a program for therapeutic maintenance and restorative sleep and climbed aboard. It wasn't really that she wanted to waste time resting, but she knew as well as anyone that medication and enhancers would only take a person so far. Beyond a certain point, the human organism could not go on without genuine sleep. Even so, she might have tried anyway, if the specimen had still been quartered in the laboratory next to her office. But now that she had moved everything to isolation, her beautiful monster was completely secure and inaccessible. She could allow herself the luxury of a few hours of sleep, plus a medical tune-up. When she woke up, she would be better than ever. It occurred to her briefly that she would probably also be sorry she had let those 3 corpses sit and rot instead of taking care of them beforehand. Well, screw it, as the kids were always saying. After she got up, she would simply toss a bunch of nanos in to clean up the dead bodies and move her specimen to a different cell, where the air was fresher. Neither Dr. Stein nor anyone else in the installation was familiar with a certain pre-evacuation Earth-1 entertainer who had enjoyed a very colorful and macabre career using the stage name Alice Cooper. Had Jason Voorhees himself had anything approaching the standard human associative thought process, Alice Cooper probably would not have meant anything to him either, because Alice predated him by well over a decade. Jason's brief childhood had not exposed him to rock music, MTV, or flamboyant singers plastered in face paint. It is possible, on the other hand, that Alice Cooper might have heard something of the legend of Jason Voorhees. But that had been over 500 years ago, and on another planet, which makes speculation an exercise in futility at the very least. In any case, long before Jason had first picked up a machete, Alice Cooper had been alarming parents and religious groups just by making records. Sex and violence figured heavily in the subject matter. One notorious song was a clever, if somewhat unsettling, declaration of non-platonic love for the literally dead. Those who had objected to the very idea 500 years before would have blanched considerably at what was occurring in the isolation cell that Dr. Stein had left unattended. Alice Cooper probably wouldn't have liked it much either. Of course, what happened while Dr. Stein slept had nothing to do with love, either for the dead or anyone else. There was a scientific explanation, but that only covered the sheer mechanics of the process. That was only what happened, not why. Had Stein actually been there to observe, she would have cobbled together some sort of scientific justification, and she would have been way off. Given 1,000,000 years to contemplate the circumstances, she probably would never have come close to grasping the existence of anti-life. As the embodiment of anti-life, Jason Voorhees was not moved to feel more kindly toward the bodies of his victims once he had eradicated the life within. But being shut in and immobilized with 3 dead bodies was not the same kind of ordeal as having to endure Dr. Stein. He was aware of decay, in the absence of any regeneration. Decay, rot, putrefaction, deep within all the invincible new material that had been modified and fashioned into a new, better, stronger body, beyond the reality of the nanos that had done the work. This was the essence of Jason Voorhees as anti-life. Rot that was ongoing and eternal, in direct opposition to growth and renewal. Eventually, Jason's essence stirred in response to the proximity of active deterioration. Nothing else might have happened. It all might have ended right there, except for the nanos in Jason's body. They were learning how to counter the force that paralyzed them, but they were still unable to neutralize it, so that the host could move unhindered. However, they could sense the nearby presence of matter somewhat similar to the host's, and it was not subject to any paralyzing force. A portion of the nanos in Jason's body had achieved some autonomous movement, even though they were unable to move him. They had stayed where they were simply because there was nowhere else to go. But there was now. They flowed out of Jason onto the edge of the table and began to spin a bridge to the morgue tray. Wing tried changing the settings on the vat in several different ways to no avail. The cells in the petri dish had reached what seemed to be a predetermined threshold beyond which they just did not develop. They didn't grow, but they didn't actually die altogether. It was as if they were waiting for an additional stimuli of some kind, and apparently they were capable of waiting forever, if necessary. This was crazy. There was no substance that behaved like this, but then there was no substance like this, period. He stood over the vat and stared down at it with his arms folded. The thing to do now was to take the stuff out of the vat and put it back where he had found it. Or maybe take it to Gottman and ask him what the hell he thought he was pulling. No point to tying up a vat when they could have been growing something useful in it instead. He moved past the LeBlanc clone and paused. Technically, the correct term was skin bag, since it had no real brain. But he couldn't bring himself to apply it to a familiar face. Goddamn Stein and her insistence on saving money and resources. It wasn't really that much more expensive to introduce a developmental scrambling element so that the clone material wouldn't look like a viable human being. Sometimes he thought Stein was being morbid rather than frugal, morbid and sadistic. He wouldn't have put it past her. He looked around the room at the other vats. About half of them were occupied now, all of them immature, which is to say they looked like children. He told himself silently. Don't dance around it with double talk. The organism is still in an immature stage of development. It will achieve adult form by tomorrow morning. They look like sleeping children, and it's obscene. His tablet chimed then, startling him. He was even more surprised to read a message from Cosi, Van Toots, on the screen, telling him he should come to her office right away. On waking up to find that she was female this morning, XXZai had written herself a note about the folly of impulsive haircutting before dressing and heading straight over to Cosi Van Toots' office, only to find it empty. According to the locator on her tablet, she had opted for breakfast, figured XX thought resigned, and turned to look at the wall monitor. Since Stein had removed her monster to the ultra-privacy of isolation, there was no more up-to-date information to be had on her prize organic-inorganic creature. There was, however, plenty of previously unseen information. XX saw this as she moved closer to the screen. Toot had decided to take advantage of Stein's continuing absence to graduate from tapping her buffers to exploring her files in depth. This was a move that Zai, now XX, really had not expected, partly because of Toot's own ethical and moral misgivings about invading anyone's privacy, even if it was Stein's, but mostly because it was difficult to conceal that much activity except on a very superficial level. Any record of intrusion could be easily erased from the buffer if you couldn't simply wait for it to scroll away all on its own, as it would do eventually, but the internal log was a different matter. The code was permanently etched into the infrastructure of the file space itself, readable as an event log via a rather complex subroutine. The result output was not in any way easy to digest at glance, even for those with a great deal of experience in numerical interpretation. On the other hand, it didn't take a lifetime of expertise in the field to spot variations in values that had previously been holding steady. That alone was a sign that something out of the ordinary had occurred, and in the absence of some sort of power failure due to earthquake or other large-scale disaster, the occurrence was guaranteed to be an intrusion of some kind. All Dr. Stein had to do was take a close look at the log for her file space, and she would know. However, it was highly unlikely that Stein would be auditing any file activity records in the near future, XX realized, chuckling silently to herself. Not in the near future, and possibly not even in the middle-distant future. Not while she had her dream specimen to fuss over and experiment with. And it just so happened that Stein's dream specimen was the subject of all the data on Kosi Fantoot's wall monitor. XX picked up the remote control from the desk and divided the screen into two windows, so she could look over the information that had already been collected from Stein's files. 5 minutes later, she was putting a call out on Toot's speed messaging system. Chapter 19. Lynn had told herself that she was on her way to Suprema Law's office to pick up a new assignment, even after she got on the elevator and pressed the button for the clinic level. Even as the elevator made its painfully slow descent, she continued to tell herself that the better course of action was to do as Omar Wing had told her. She had to go through the motions, build up her presence, and as an ordinary intern. Then she would be able to move around without arousing anyone's suspicion. The elevator finally crawled to a stop, and the doors opened promptly, as if there were a high-speed express lift. She poked her head out to look up and down the hallway. No one there. Apparently this area of the installation didn't see a lot of traffic. Now get back on the elevator and go to Suprema Law's office, she told herself as she headed for the clinic. What makes you think you're going to get past the first airlock? And even if you do, you haven't even come up with an obviously lame excuse as to why you're here. Probably because you still haven't figured out what the hell you're actually going to do. Look at Sophia and wait for her to open her eyes again? And what do you do if she does? Slap a medicated patch on her so the two of you can bust out of there? Then she was standing in front of the entrance to the clinic, and although she still didn't have a clue as to what she should do next, she couldn't bring herself simply to turn around and walk away. She rang for admittance. For all of a second, nothing happened, and she was suddenly seized by the strong feeling that she had just done exactly the wrong thing. Then she heard the seal on the door release, and a male voice said, "It's about damn time." There was no chance for her to dwell on how self-conscious she felt in a full-body condom on this visit. The nurse barely glanced at her while he rushed through a sketchy explanation of how to read the monitoring equipment, or rather, how to tell if something was wrong with one of the patients before he left practically at a run, leaving her there by herself. She surveyed the room full of unconscious soldiers with confusion and trepidation tightening in the pit of her stomach. What if something did go wrong with one of them? Or even worse, more than one? What had he said to do if any of them seemed to be waking up? She tried to remember, but her mind had very helpfully gone blank on her. While she was still trying to decide whether she should panic or not, a chime sounded from the main console. It took her a moment to figure out that someone else was ringing for admittance, and another second or two before she located the monitor and saw that it was Fredo. "I didn't know there would be two of us holding things down here while the grown-ups have their big secret meeting," Fredo told her. "Me neither," Lynn replied truthfully. "Is something going on?" "Looks that way." He ambled over to the nearest patient and checked the small readout screen on the panel at the foot of the bed. "I don't suppose you know what it is," she said, hopeful as she followed him. No, but with any luck we'll be able to find out. He glanced at her with an enigmatic, near smile. Really? Oh yeah, every inch of this place is bugged, you know. He paused at the door of the next bed to look at her again. You did know that, didn't you? I figured it would be. And I mean every inch. Showers, toilets, bedrooms. There's nowhere that they're not listening and watching. Except for the isolation area, where Dr. Stein is hiding out currently. Let me guess, that was her idea? I don't honestly know, Fredo admitted, laughing a bit sheepishly. But that sounds about right. So if someone's always watching everything that goes on here, why is anyone actually bothering to have a secret meeting? Fredo shook his head. I said the whole place is bugged. I didn't say someone was always watching. Lynn raised her eyebrows. Now I'm confused. He smiled at her in a kindly way, and in spite of everything, she felt her heart suddenly skip a beat. Stop that, she scolded herself fiercely. This isn't an undergraduate chem lab, and he's not some cute grad student instructor. But she still couldn't stop herself from checking out his butt as he moved on to the next bed. The whole place is under surveillance, but it doesn't mean that anyone is actually looking. I mean, it is possible to call up a time-stamped record for any area of the installation, your room, for example, or mine, and find out what was going on at the time. But no one will unless there's a good reason, like if I were found dead in my room, for example. You sound pretty sure about that, Lynn said skeptically. I would have thought they'd have AIs watching all the time, alerting someone to anything they were programmed to find suspicious. Fredo laughed. AIs? You have to be joking. Sure, they had them here at the beginning, but they kept flashing up alerts all the time. And the face recognition programs were so poor, they couldn't tell that someone in a full-body condom was the same person as in their normal clothes. No, the AIs were just too damn unintelligent, too stupid, to carry on using them. So it's only humans that can actually watch any of the surveillance. And you can be pretty sure no one is actually bothering to do that most of the time. She looked past him toward the end of the row, wondering what she would do this time if Sophia opened her eyes again. You mean they respect our privacy? I wish I could share your faith that the nobler aspects of human nature will prevail. He gave a hard laugh. Nobler aspects have absolutely nothing to do with it. Nobody's going to look because nobody's got the time. Not even Dr. Stein. Sure, she's paranoid enough that the whole idea of privacy is, at best, a personal affront to her, and at worst, which is probably 90% of the time, a plot by her enemies to destroy her. But she doesn't care to spend a single moment doing anything that doesn't directly contribute to the greater glory of Dr. Stein. Accidental virtue? Lynn muttered, barely aware that she was speaking aloud. Hey, if that's the only kind available, why turn your nose up at it? I certainly wouldn't, Fredo chuckled. Point taken, said Lynn. So does this blanket surveillance deal have something to do with how you're going to find out what all the grown-ups are up to? Fredo smiled over his shoulder at her. Say, you're not really a grunt, are you? What would make you ask me something like that? Lynn blinked at him. I don't know. His smile turned apologetic. A number of the interns here are retrained grunts. I'm not. And Suprema Law said LeBlanc's replacement was also non-military. But just now, when you asked me about blanket surveillance, I suddenly flashed on you having some kind of military experience. Well, I don't. Lynn did her best to keep her tone light, in spite of the fact that she felt as if she weren't being entirely truthful with him. I've never been in the military. Never even gave a thought to enlisting. Even when I was going through my phase of wanting to be a starship commander back in the depths of my painful adolescence. Hell, I don't even know anyone in the, or anyone who did something like that, she finished lamely, hoping he wouldn't notice her momentary floundering. Which was completely stupid anyway. Why the hell was she so jumpy about telling a lie all of a sudden? She was living a lie just by being in the installation at all. It was the idea of lying to him, she realized. She didn't want to actively lie to him or any of the other interns, military or not. They didn't deserve that. And depending on what she found out here, they weren't going to like the idea that they had had a spy in their ranks. What makes you so sure there hasn't been one all along? A small voice in her mind whispered suddenly. It made sense. If Stein really was so paranoid, why wouldn't she have planted someone among the interns to act as her eyes and ears? Are you all right? Lynn looked up at Fredo sharply. Pardon? He motioned for her to lift her chin slightly as he studied her face for a long moment. You just about turned green all of a sudden, like you were going to be violently sick, which, I'm sure I don't have to tell you, is an extremely undesirable thing to do when you're wearing a full-body condom. A small surge of self-consciousness cut through the anxiety pressing hard on her stomach, and for a moment, she actually felt mildly amused at herself. In the middle of a serious, even dangerous situation, she thought, the intrepid girl reporter could still spare a couple of seconds to wonder if wearing a full-body condom made her ass look big. I'm fine, she told Fredo quickly. Are you sure? You know, sometimes the nano filters in the headpiece get clogged, and before you know it, you're dizzy, and I'm fine, she said again, taking a deep breath and letting it out again. No problem with the air filters. I'm not going to throw up or faint or anything, really, I promise you. Fredo stood back from her, tilting his head to one side. Then what are you so worried about, Lynn? The grown-ups and their big secret meeting, she replied before she could think better of it. He gave a short laugh. Yeah, me too. A little. What do you really think it's about? Lynn asked him. The sex maniacs, he said promptly. I think something happened to them. Maybe the same thing that happened to LeBlanc. He shrugged. But we'll see. Zelda said she'd buzz me when she got the tap set up. Zelda's tapping the meeting? Lynn was honestly surprised. How? Fredo sighed. Don't ask me. I've got no head whatsoever for gadgets. He paused suddenly, and his serious expression deepened as he looked at her. You know, I'm really surprised that Supreme Allah didn't tell me he was sending you down here as well. He doesn't usually forget to mention if 2 or more of us are sharing an assignment. Maybe the big emergency meetings got him distracted, Lynn suggested. Fredo was about to say something else when the phone buzzed. Ah, the hotline is up and operational. He all but ran back to the front desk. This doesn't make any damn sense, Ramirez Gold said for what Wing thought could easily have been the millionth time. What makes sense to you isn't an issue here, XX Zai snapped. Kosi Fantoot put a restraining hand on his, no, Wing corrected himself, her arm. Sometimes it was hard to keep up with XX Zai's shifting persuasions, especially when you couldn't even go by the haircuts. The issue is, Stein's got some kind of large and extremely dangerous creature hidden in the isolation area, and as soon as it got here, people began to go missing. She looked around at everyone else in Toot's office. I say we hit the panic button and evacuate now. And I say we better make goddamn sure that thing doesn't follow us out of here before we do anything, said Haddad O'Reilly. She was standing to the right of the wall monitor with the remote control in her hand. She pointed at the screen and brought up 2 separate analyses. One from Dr. Stein's files and the one Stein had received from the government anti-terrorist agency on New Harvard letterhead. She activated the laser pointer to indicate the latter. This is a complete description of the creature as it was when Braithwaite Lowe and his merry band of college kids pried it out of the cryo chamber on Earth 1. He was already dangerous before the nanos ever got near him. Our technology didn't make him like this. It just gave him an upgrade and a little makeover. But it doesn't make any... Gold caught himself as everyone in the room turned to glare at him. It's scientifically impossible is what I mean, he said, almost wailing. Don't any of you understand that? All of that so-called data on that screen is scientifically impossible. Yeah, said Haddad O'Reilly, sticking her fist on her hip. Then why don't you go tell Stein that her pretty little monster doesn't really exist? I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I'm saying all that this is bullshit. Gold waved at the monitor. Either it's just a load of crap planted by Stein herself to throw us off, or it's an encryption we can't read properly. Wing was disconcerted to find that everyone had suddenly turned to look at him now, as if he had actually had some sort of expert knowledge. He grimaced at them all and shrugged. Well, I suppose that's a possibility. Ha! Gold declared, absurdly triumphant. But either way, Wing went on, giving him a dirty look, it doesn't change the fact that we've got a hostile of unknown origins on the premises. and Dr. Stein seems to be the only person who knows how to exercise any sort of control over it." "What about Gunner?" piped up Suprema Law. "What about him?" said XX. "I wasn't about to call him in on this so he could run off and tell teacher." "No, but he might know something more about this monster," Suprema Law replied with his usual loud voice. XX opened her mouth to argue, but Wing cut her off. "No, Suprema Law's right," he said. "Believe it or not, Gunnar really might know something. He told them about the organic and inorganic cells he had appropriated from Gunnar's lab and planted in one of the cloning vats. I wanted to see what they were going to grow into, if anything." His words seemed to hang in the air. Everyone was looking at him again, each of their faces a mirror of his own dawning horror as he realized what he had done. For some unmeasured time he felt as if he were both frozen in place and falling from a great height. He tried to say something else, but all at once Haddad O'Reilly was yanking him off the cabinet he had been half sitting on and shoving him toward the door. "God damn it, Omar. Get your ass down to the lab and abort those fucking things right now before the fucking crop comes up." "Sophira! Lieutenant Sophira! Please, wake up and look at me." Down at the front of the room, Fredo kept checking all the readouts to make sure that all the rest of the soldiers were receiving the same dosage of stimulant at the same rate. What he and Lynn were doing carried through enough penalties to put them both away for 3 lifetimes at the very least. But that didn't scare him anywhere nearly as much as the story Lynn had dropped on him, combined with what they had heard via Zelda's tap. Zelda herself was on her way to crash the party in Kosi Fantoot's office, which was Lynn's idea. "Get them all down to the clinic," she told Zelda, while she and Fredo started waking up the cavalry. Or was it cavalry? He could never remember which was right. "I'm giddy on adrenaline," he thought. He had to steady himself. What was it Zelda was always saying? Get a grip? But how? This was crazy. What Lynn had told him about 3 Mile Island simply could not have happened. She had to have been making it up. Only, here were all the soldiers, and Stein had that creature. "Rena, please, open your eyes!" Lynn was shouting. Fredo turned to see that she had the soldier sitting up in bed now. Although her movements were still sluggish and uncoordinated, Lynn had insisted on waking her ahead of all the rest of them, even though Fredo could see that she was really only the second highest ranking officer. But Lynn either knew her better than the others, or thought the woman would know more about what to do. Maybe she'd been one of the more resourceful grunts during the events Lynn had run very rapidly past him at 3 Mile Island. Certainly, if the incident had been as bad as Lynn had told him, anyone who had survived had to be pretty resourceful, or just unbelievably lucky. He wondered which Lynn had been. He wasn't quite clear on that, and he didn't really want to be. He had a very strong feeling that in this particular situation, understanding was not going to increase his chances of living through it. "Fredo," Lynn called, "help me get her up on her feet and walk her around." He took a quick look at the readouts, and then ran down to where Lynn had her shoulder under the other woman's right arm. He moved in on the other side, catching her before she could slump to the floor, and slung her left arm over his shoulders. Her head bobbed up as she turned to look at him in groggy surprise. "Hi, I'm Fredo," he said lamely. "I'm a friend of Lynn's, too." "Lieutenant Sophira," she mumbled faintly and started to go out again. Then all at once she jumped, startled, and turned to look at him again, this time in groggy suspicion. "Is that you? You pinched my ass?" she demanded. "No, Sophira, it was me," Lynn said urgently as they began walking her towards the front of the room. "Wake up or I'll do it again." "Double devil dog dare ya," Sophira said, wagging her head slowly from side to side. "Kill ya." "You gotta be awake to kill anything," Lynn told her. "Come on, Sophira, wake up. We're in trouble here." Fredo could feel the soldier's legs becoming steadier and stronger. "Kinda trouble?" she asked Lynn, her words a little less slurred now. "Like at the power station," Lynn said. "That thing is back." "Creature?" The soldier's body suddenly stiffened in the curve of Fredo's arm, as more of her weight shifted to her own feet. "Killer?" They captured it and brought it here with you," Lynn said urgently. "Here?" The other woman tried to look around. "Some government project. You've been unconscious for over 2 weeks," Fredo added. "What the fuck?" she said, bristling in her grasp. "What the fuck for?" "For experiments," said Lynn. They were going to experiment on you, all of you. They wanted to turn you into something just like that thing. Completely alert now, the soldier dug in her heels and stopped, snatching her arms away from them. She looked from Lynn to Fredo, and then suddenly Fredo found himself trying to breathe with her hand almost crushing his windpipe. Not him, not him, Lynn yelled, pulling at her hands. Let him go, he's with us. The last thing Fredo heard as darkness rose up and swallowed him was Lynn begging the soldier not to kill him. The last person Omar Wing expected to find waiting for him in the cloning lab was Gunnar Gottman, deep in the throes of what one of the interns referred to as a genuine hissy fit. Who the fuck told you that? You could take my cells, Gottman demanded somewhat shrilly as he stood over the vat, all but stamping his foot. Who the fuck told you that you could just come into my lab and dismiss my intern from the assignment that I had given her and just help your fucking self to something that I was working on? Who the fuck told you that? God told me, Wing said, irritated as he hit the abort switch. The lid released immediately and slid open. He caught a fleeting whiff of cool, sterile air as he stopped to reach into the vat for the pet petri dish. Fuck you, Gottman shouted and gave him a shove so hard that he fell over backwards. Wing stared up at him, stunned. He had always known Gottman was a prick, but he had never figured the man for a psycho prick. The son of a bitch looked like he was having a genuine psychotic break. Who the fuck do you think you are? Gottman bellowed at him. You all think you can just walk all over me. Now, is that it? Is that what Bitchenstein said? Did Bitchenstein give you all permission to treat me like shit? Who? Wing asked, completely mystified. You want to take over all my stuff now? Then you go right the fuck ahead. Gottman bent over and plucked the petri dish out of the vat. But you're not going to rub my nose in it, you son of a bitch. I'm going to rub your nose in it. Gottman lunged at him and mashed the petri dish roughly against his face. Immediately it cracked into several pieces, and all at once Wing found himself with a face full of blood and glass. He struck out blindly at Gottman and connected with something rather sensitive. The other man let out a cry and staggered back, clutching himself. You bastard! You're all bastards! Wing mopped the blood and glass from his face with the bottom of his shirt, still unable to get his mind around what was happening. Then he caught sight of Gottman standing several feet away, still holding himself between his legs and panting with rage. But not just plain old garden variety rage, he realized. This was genuine old-fashioned roid rage. In spite of everything, Wing almost laughed out loud. The asshole was taking steroids. Unbelievable. Gottman was supposed to be an educated man, a scientist distinguished enough to get in on one of Stein's exclusive projects. Although there were those rumors his presence here was really courtesy of a high-ranking relative. But even if that was true, he did have 3 or 4 doctorates, all of which he had earned honestly, without the need for family connections. And he still didn't know better than to gobble bulk-ups. Over 500 years of documentation as to the side effects and long-term damage, and Gottman still thought having the muscles was worth all of that? Well, sure, why not, Wing thought as he started to push himself slowly up to his feet. The highly intelligent could be as stupid as anyone else when they put their minds to it. Although he would have expected something a bit more inventive from Gottman. Oh, you still feel like taking me on? Gottman jeered. He began trying to rip his shirt off with one hand. The other one was still cupping his crotch. Before you do anything you're going to regret, you better have a good look at what you're up against. See this? He tried to point at his chest and pull his arm out of his sleeve all at once. It'll be like punching a steel vault. You'll break your knuckles. Wing backed away, knowing that if he actually turned around, he would only provoke Gottman into attacking him. Gottman shuffled toward him, still clutching his balls, glaring viciously and muttering threats while he tried to free his hand from his tangled shirt sleeve. To Wing's relief, however, he didn't seem inclined to close the distance between them. Maybe that punch in the balls had hurt Gunnar more than he thought it had. Nonetheless, he had had more than enough of this shit. For a place that was supposedly under total and continuous surveillance, it sure could be hard to get any attention around here when you really need it. Security, Wing said, addressing the ceiling for no reason other than it felt right. Security to the clone lab. Code 000. What did you call me? Gottman wanted to know. Urgent, Wing replied to the ceiling. Dr. Stein had never been less prepared for anything than she was for the sight that greeted her when, refreshed and renewed by several hours of enhanced therapeutic sleep, She let herself back into the cell where she had left the new specimen with 3 presumably useless dead bodies. The rotting cadavers she had expected to find awaiting disposal were gone. No, not just gone. They had vanished, utterly and completely, as if some force had erased every aspect of their existence. Not even the smell remained. The thought popped into her mind that Dan Nin had taken it on himself to clean up for her without being asked. She tried to summon a mental image of him coming in with a cleansing kit full of nanos and then discarded the idea. Even if by some miracle it had occurred to him to do such a thing, that would never have explained what was now lying on the morgue tray. Exactly what could have explained it, however, was beyond her, at least for the moment. She took a tentative step toward it and then stopped, unconsciously pressing one hand over her heart that was hammering in her chest. Very uncharacteristic, this kind of physiological reaction. Dr. Stein was in charge of herself. It was extremely rare that her body could do anything or would do anything unless she had specifically told it to. The only other time in recent memory that she had experienced an elevated heart rate was when she had first laid eyes on the beautiful specimen. But that hadn't been half as intense as what was happening to her now. When the going gets intense, the intents get hypertension, babbled her mind. She let out a single high-pitched laugh and then covered her mouth with her other hand. Oh God, not hysteria now, too. She tore her hand away from her face and shoved it into the pocket of her lab coat hard enough to make the cloth groan with the strain. The healthy supply of patches she kept there at all times was actually meant to provide an immediate solution for the problem of sudden emotional outbursts from staff members. A precaution she had been extremely glad she had taken after the incident in the cloning lab with Zelda Yamaguchi. Then there were all of Gunnar Gottman's little episodes, most of which she could actually head off almost before they ever got started, and all without even realizing that anything had happened, or not happened. But there had been very few times when she had felt the need to patch herself. Her primary reason for doing it was simply to familiarize herself with the drug and the effect that various dosage had on her, just so she would understand what had happened if she ever found herself involuntarily on the receiving end of someone else's good or bad intentions. Although she had to admit privately that after an especially annoying day full of encounters with oversensitive interns, professional staff who actually believed they were good enough to call themselves her colleagues, and the occasional clueless grunt, it was a relief to know she could patch away the aggravation in a matter of mere seconds. Then equilibrium was simply there inside of her, not in a sudden way, but as if it had never been gone, and she was gazing at the form lying on the morgue tray while wondering idly in the back of her mind why she would let herself be so disconcerted by an unexpected development. After all, it wasn't as though this was the first time. The form laying on the morgue tray looked like someone had tried to produce a creature as similar to her beautiful specimen as possible, but from somewhat different resources. The size and physical proportions were virtually identical to the original. She saw this as she moved into the gap between the medical table and the morgue tray. The position of their legs seemed to differ in some slight way, although she was unable to say how. Perhaps there was some minute variation in the width or angle of the hip bones. The new creature also seemed to comprise of more organic material than the original. Either that or there was more showing on the outside. The morgue tray had no equipment for examination or analysis. Stein looked around for her handheld scanner, then remembered she had left it in the cell where she had spent the night, or day, or whatever those last 8 hours or so had been. The realization that she had been so absorbed in her work that she had actually lost track of the quotidian didn't bother her half as much as forgetting that she had left the handheld scanner in the other cell. A memory lapse that caused her to be sloppy or careless with equipment just wasn't like her at all. The mixture of organic and inorganic material on the upper torso of the new creature was completely different from the original specimen, not only in quantity but in substance and even definition. Certain areas of the thing's chest were ambiguous. She could not tell whether the matter was organic or inorganic just by looking at it. Before she could think better of it, she had placed her ungloved hand in the center of the thing's chest. She snatched her hand back immediately, frowning over her momentary lack of impulse control. At least she hoped it was momentary. The idea that an impulse could have gotten away from her in spite of the fact that she was medicated was somewhat disturbing. Like her memory lapse, she thought unhappily, Now she had one more thing to worry about. She looked at her hand, saw nothing out of the ordinary. Not that she had expected to see anything. The nanos in her new specimen were of the unadorned, stripped-down variety, which she had always preferred to the sort used by everyone else in the universe. There was no real difference between the two kinds in either their basic function or their effectiveness, except for the fact that Stein's nanos of choice lacked the extra subquirks that produced pretty silvery lines during periods of nano-activity. This special effect had been immediately adopted as an industry standard by nano suppliers everywhere, for no other reason, in Dr. Stein's view, except that vast, uneducated, inelegant, and despicable multitude known as the general public really liked it when their technology produced pretty silvery lines. The thought now occurred to her, fleetingly, that pretty silvery lines might actually be useful. She rubbed her thumb over the skin, but the only thing she felt was foolishness. Think, she ordered herself. Her mindless impulse might have contaminated this thing. It was much more likely, however, that she had contaminated herself if the nanos that had created it were still active. She had no idea whether they were or not, and, absent some marked change in its appearance that would clearly indicate an ongoing process, there was no way to find out for certain without a scanner. There was also the possibility that she had already been contaminated. The idea appeared in her mind unbidden and fully formed, a series of images somehow compressed to a single unit. Nanos had migrated from her specimen to the nearest corpse, and from there to the others, without the need for intervention by any outside agency or force, which meant that they could have migrated to her at any time without her ever being aware of it. So go get the frickin' scanner, which is what you should have done as soon as you saw what happened in here, she thought. Dr. Stein sighed, feeling mildly annoyed with herself. Maybe it was all the sleep she'd had, she thought suddenly. Too many hours of unconsciousness had left her addled instead of rested. She was turning to leave when a large, hard, and relentlessly strong hand clamped itself onto her right arm. Even as she gave a startled jump, a second hand took hold of her left arm in an equally fierce and unbreakable grip. Since Dan Newman's assignment with Dr. Stein was exclusive, he wasn't in the general rotation for security detail or anything else. But Dr. Stein had ordered him to monitor all the emergency channels at all times, and when he heard Omar Wing yelling for help, he automatically responded. Technically, he had no obligation to do so, but Dr. Stein had no immediate need for his services, which left him on call but temporarily unoccupied. According to his training, however, all military personnel in the installation were expected to take appropriate action in any emergency unless specifically or forcibly prevented. Even so, had he been somewhere else in the installation, in his quarters or down in the barracks or even on guard outside, Dr. Stein's old office, he would have stood back and left it to the regular security detail. But it so happened that he was barely 30 feet from the entrance to the cloning lab at the time. Security wouldn't make it for another 20 seconds at the very least. It was his duty to render aid immediately. He slammed the master key override card that Dr. Stein had given him against the door as soon as he felt the lock disengage. He shoved as hard as he could. The door flew open and hit the wall with a bang that sent a shudder through the floor. Someone let out a startled cry. His sidearm was in his hand before he registered that the two other men in the room were Omar Wing and Gunner Gottman. "Don't shoot!" Gottman hollered, putting both hands up, or trying to. His shirt and lab coat were half torn off, and one hand was still stuck in the sleeve. Several feet away from him, Wing wasn't wearing his lab coat, something that wouldn't have made Dr. Stein any too happy if she had seen him. Lab coats were the law with her. Jesus, was that blood all over the front of his shirt? Dan Newman frowned, taking in the smears on the man's face and hands and the drops on the floor that led back to some shards of broken glass. "Dr. Wing, are you injured? Do you need medical assistance?" he asked, watching both men carefully while he tried to figure out who could have assaulted whom. "It's nothing," Wing said. "I think the bleeding's already stopped." He touched his face, filling the area around his nose gingerly, although Newman couldn't see anything wrong there. "Dr. Gottman," he said, turning to the other man and unconsciously taking a tighter grip on his weapon. "Are you all right, sir? Do you need medical assistance?" Gottman stared back at him with an odd, offended look. He lifted his chin belligerently, and Newman saw that his mouth was trembling. The man was still standing in the same position, one raised hand still caught in the end of his sleeve. He sighted on Gutman's right kneecap. "Dr. Wing, you called a cold 000, is that correct?" he asked, never taking his eyes off Gutman. "That's right, Corporal," Wing replied, his voice deliberately calm and quiet. "You are aware that code 000 indicates a threat to safety created by person or persons under the influence of some substance or contaminant." Newman barely paused before remembering to add, "Sir?" "Dr. Gottman is unwell," Wing said. "Fuck you, you fucking asshole!" Gottman's eyes bulged as they swiveled in Wing's direction, but he kept his hands raised. "Dr. Gutman, I'm warning you to calm down, sir," Newman told him firmly. "Right now you need to kneel down on the floor and clasp your hands behind your head." "Kneel down on the floor?" Gottman actually reared back a little, his eyes bulging again. "And do what with my hands?" He made a little motion with his trapped hand. "How am I supposed to do that exactly?" "Well, just do the best you can, sir," Newman said, keeping his tone firm. "You can put your hands on your head." "Put my hands on my head," Gottman fumed, and did so. "Motherfucker, I look like an idiot. Happy now?" "No, sir. I want you to kneel down, too," Newman said. "I will not," Gottman informed him loftily. "I'm a scientist, you clueless jerk-off, not some friggin' grunt you found breaking into the fucking liquor cabinet." "Sir, unless you have some problem or handicap that prevents you from kneeling down right now, I will be forced to help you." "It so happens I do," Gottman said quickly, his voice rising in pitch again. "It so happens I've got Osgood Schlatter's disease. I can't kneel. I can't kneel, and you can't make me." Newman swiveled his eye to Wing, who nodded, albeit reluctantly. "It is a real thing," he said, glancing at Gottman. "See?" Gottman's chin went up another inch. "Even he backs me up." "Most often found in adolescent boys," Wing added, one side of his mouth curling sourly, "so I guess he must be telling the truth." Gottman turned his upper body toward Wing. "Fuck you, you fucking—" "Dr. Gottman, if you can't kneel down, then please lie down on your stomach," Newman said loudly, talking over him. "What?" Gottman turned back to him, utterly flabbergasted. "You want me to what?" he went on without waiting for an answer. "Why, you low-life, inbred, brain-damaged mutant son of a—" Security chose that moment to arrive and put a tranquilizer dart in the exposed flesh of his rib cage. Gottman went down immediately, hitting the floor on his left side before he rolled over onto his back. "Thank God," Wing said, his shoulders slumping as he let his breath out in a rush. "And thank you, too, guys," he added to the security detail, waving one hand weakly. Holstering his sidearm, Newman went over to him and steered him gently but firmly to a nearby stool. A chair would have been better, but Wing looked ready to keel over, and the stool was the closest thing to him. "Are you all right, Dr. Wing?" he asked. "Yeah, thanks, Corporal. The man blinked at his name tag. "Wait, you're Linda's brother?" "Yes, sir." The urge to ask Wing if he knew anything about her almost overwhelmed him. "Are you sure you're not seriously injured in some way, sir?" Wing made a dismissive gesture with one hand, shaking his head slightly. "When was the last time you saw your sister Linda?" He felt his mouth drop open. Had Wing really just asked him about Linda, or was he hearing things now? "Corporal?" Wing prodded, not unkindly. "The last time I saw Linda," Newman said, still uncertain, Actually, I don't remember exactly right this second, sir, but it was at least 5 days ago, maybe a week." "I saw her a couple days ago," Wing told him. "You did, sir? Where was that?" The question was out of his mouth before he could think better of it, but apparently Wing didn't view his question as insubordination. "She was standing guard outside pre-op," Wing told him, "when all the grunts in the clinic suddenly showed infected, including the 6 Stein had brought up for neurosurgery." "Oh, well, thank you for letting me know, sir," Newman said. Wing studied him for a moment. "You don't know where she is now, do you?" "No, sir," he hesitated. Do you?" Wing shook his head. "Did anyone tell you anything about where she was sent?" "Nothing specific, sir," Newman replied. "Although I did get the impression from Master Sergeant Carroll that her sudden transfer may have been disciplinary in some way." Wing raised his eyebrows. Well, if you should happen to hear from her or hear anything about her, I'd appreciate it if you'd let me know, and I'll do the same for you. Thank you, sir. That's very kind of you, sir, Newman told him. But I, would also appreciate it if you didn't mention our little arrangement to Dr. Stein, Wing added. I'd just like to keep it private, and it really has nothing to do with your duties to Dr. Stein. Dan blinked at him, surprised. No, I guess not. All right, I'll keep this just between us, like you want me to. Thanks. Wing eased himself off the stool and looked down at his shirt somewhat ruefully. Christ, what a mess. Are you sure you shouldn't see the doctor, sir? Newman asked, concerned. Nah, I'm okay. It looks worse than it is. Anytime you get a cut on the face, you bleed like a stuck pig because of all the little blood vessels. The face, sir? Newman peered at the man's face carefully, looking for any breaks in the skin, but there weren't any. Guy didn't even have pimples. Was he dizzy or something? Maybe Gottman had hit him in the head before he'd gotten there. Yes, Wing said, frowning at him as if he were dizzy. Gunner got me right in the kisser with the petri dish. My nose didn't break, but it sure did. Newman lowered his gaze to the blood on the man's shirt. Sir, I thought he cut you somewhere around the midsection, he said slowly. Just because that's where all the blood is. He looked up at Wing's face again. But there's nothing wrong with your face, sir. Nothing at all. Wing felt the area all around his nose with careful fingers, obviously bewildered. Newman looked around, spotted the metal tray with the mirror finish lying on a counter, and brought it to him. See? He said, holding it up in front of the man's face. There's nothing there, sir. Wing took the tray for him without a word, gaping at his reflection like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Okay, he said finally. Thanks, Corporal, you can go. You sure you're all right, sir? Newman asked him, concerned. Because maybe you should go. I'm fine, Nin. You'd better go now. Yes, sir. He did a crisp parade ground about face and headed toward the door still hanging wide open. Nobody had cleaned up the shards of broken glass on the floor, he noted. Security certainly wouldn't have. That wasn't the kind of mess they cleaned up. What the hell, he'd go ahead and do it himself, Newman decided, just as a personal favor to Dr. Wing because he was being so nice about Linda. It wouldn't take but 2 seconds anyways, provided he could find a dustpan and brush or a reasonable substitute. The sight of the girl in the vat hit him with all the force of a physical blow, like he'd gotten hit in the face and somehow that had knocked the wind out of him, because he couldn't get any air. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't yell for help, couldn't do a goddamn thing except stand there and look down at the little girl in the cloning vat and understand exactly what it meant for him to be seeing her lying under the glass cover. He had never been the sharpest knife in the drawer, but he didn't have to have a razor's edge to understand this. He became aware then that Omar Wing was speaking, possibly to him, although he didn't have the slightest idea what the man was saying and didn't care. Dr. Wing, he said, raising his voice to talk over him, I just found out where Linda is. He dragged his gaze away from the vat to Wing, who was standing with a tablet in one hand, using the phone function. Linda's dead, he went on, as if Wing had responded. My sister's dead, and I'm pretty sure that Dr. Stein had something to do with it. Fredo came back to consciousness to find Lynn waving a stem bottle under his nose. Wow, but did that stem ever do the job, and fast, he thought. The grunt lieutenant who'd been choking him must have been persuaded by Lynn to let go, and was somewhere down at the other end of the lab trying to speed up the awakening of the rest of the comatose grunts. Are you okay? Fredo? Tell me you're okay. She didn't mean it. She only just woke up, you know. 2 weeks drugged, comatose? That's going to make anyone a bit paranoid. His neck and throat were sore, but not so much that he couldn't speak, although he had to swallow a few times first. I'm fine, but I'll tell you, your friend has one hell of a chokehold. Sophia came over to them. Come on, Lynn. Stop fannying around with him. He's okay. And you, Freddie, or whatever your fucking name is, that is nothing compared to what you'd have got if I'd really been angry. Now get up and help us get the rest of my guys awake. Fredo got to his feet and looked around. No permanent damage done, anyways. But he reminded himself to always stay on the right side of Sophia. For what seemed to Fredo forever, all three of them worked on getting the grunts woken up. In the meantime, Lynn was bringing Sophia up to speed with their situation in the research complex. At least, insofar as Lynn herself was up to speed, which was probably no more than he was. When all the grunts were finally awake enough to listen, Sophia gave them a rapid-fire summary of just how the sky was falling in and the bottom was falling out, with occasional corrections from Lynn. After a final pep talk, Sophia finally gave her mouth a break, and one of the grunts took the opportunity to ask a question. "So, who's in charge?" "Well, it seems that they sent Cosgrove elsewhere, so I guess it's down to me." The grunt shook his head. "Of this place, I mean." "Now that's a good question." Sophia made a harsh noise that wasn't quite a laugh. "Your guess is as good as mine." Lynn piped up. "Dr. Stein is the nominal head of the project here, but it's a military operation. Right now, Stein's holed up somewhere doing God knows what with that monster that attacked the power station." She looked around at the soldiers, who obviously didn't like what they had just heard. "But at least we know which side we're on." "Which would be?" queried the grunt. "Our side, soldier," barked Sophia, "and this Stein is on the other side. So anyone who's against her is on our side too. Got it?" A guy Fredo had heard Sophia call a step spoke next. "We got that, Lieutenant. We're all on the same side, but I should just point out that our side is distinctly lacking in anything to defend itself with. Anyone know if there's a armory in this joint, and if there is, who's got the key?" Sophia looked stumped, but without a moment's hesitation, Fredo said, "Black Carol," and headed for the comm unit. "Black Carol?" Lynn and Sophia said in perfect unison. Startled, Lynn turned to ask Sophia if that meant anything to her, but the lieutenant was hurrying to catch up with Fredo, saying, "Are you shitting me? Big bad Blackie's in the house?" For the first time, Master Sergeant Black Carol found herself thinking that one monitor really wasn't enough after all. At the same time, she knew she would have been going crazy if she'd actually had more than one. As it was, she was going cross-eyed and wall-eyed by turns, trying to see all 4 of the windows on her screen at the same time. Of course, a good part of that was the shock of finding out Rena the Rocket Sophia was one of the grunts Stein had been keeping under wraps in the clinic for the last 2 weeks, which only made it that much harder trying to deal with and calm down Dan Newman. Not that she could blame him. All along she had had a bad feeling about Stein and Linda Newman, and now that she knew she had been right, she had to figure out a course of action and fast. But along with Dan Newman, or Dan Nan as Stein liked to call him for short, and Rocket talking a mile a minute, she also had a couple of interns all worked up about something, and Ledbetter from security reporting in to tell her that they had just had to take down one of the scientists on a code 000, but he couldn't raise anyone from medical to come have a look at him. Finally, she gave up trying to get a word in edgewise and activated the crisis override protocol, which cut the audio on her end but not on theirs, so she could talk without interruption. They all knew they'd been muted, but it didn't stop most of them from running their mouths, of course. Quite the opposite, in fact. She could see that except for Rocket, they were all yelling, as if they really believed that that would do any good. "Listen up, callers," she said, not so much raising her voice as projecting it in a way that meant to cut through all the noise on their respective ends. "I've got 4 of you on the line at once, and it sounds like we got a multi-lane, 5-star goat fuck here. But you all got to shut up and listen, or we're all going to be where the goat is right now." Dan Newman got the message right away, as did Ledbetter. The 2 interns, Zelda and Roz, according to their name tags, took a little bit longer, so she left them muted. "Okay, Dan, you first," she said, restoring two-way communication to his line. "Stein's got Linda, cells in a vat, correct?" "Yes, Sarge," he said. "I'm still here in the cloning lab with Dr. Wing, Dr. Omar Wing, and there's something wrong with him." He looked off to his left briefly. "Let me talk to him," she said. "I'm sorry, Sarge, I can't get him to come near me. He's down the other end of the lab. Hell, now he won't even turn around and look at me anymore. He says there's something wrong with him." "What is it? Is he sick?" Newman shook his head. "I don't know what it is. He said something about something getting into his face and he can feel it. I don't know what he's talking about. See, Dr. Gottman went bug house. Dr. Wing says he's been roiding up, and when I came in here he was threatening Dr. Wing, and he'd already hit him. There was blood all over his shirt. Then Ledbetter and the rest of the security came and took Dr. Gottman down and got him out of here. So I was going to clean up the broken glass myself, but when I went looking for something to use, I saw and I recognized her. I knew the girl in the vat couldn't have come from nobody else but Linda, and that's enough, Corporal, Carol said, firmly but not unkindly. You carrying any patches? Newman blinked a couple of times. He patted himself down and came up with something flat and square in a wrapper. Yeah. His dazed expression morphed into embarrassment. Patch yourself up and get a grip, mister, Carol told him. Hang on, I'll get back to you in a minute. She turned her attention to Rena the Rocket with a broad, grim smile. What the fuck are you doing in my house, Rocket? That's Lieutenant Rocket to you, Sarge. And to answer your question, fuck if I know. I didn't even know this was your house. Near as I can tell, me and my guys were about to get recycled for experiments. Ah, fuck me, Carol said, horrified. No, fuck me, the other women replied with a dark laugh. Although after we were all used up, you were probably going to be next. You guys got an armory? Carol nodded. It's a good one, too. But if that's not enough for you, there's always a Launchpad. You're shitting me, Rocket said, incredulous, and paused, obviously waiting for Carol to admit she wasn't serious. Come on, you are shitting me, aren't you? No, it's pretty much bare bones. No frills whatsoever, meant for a one-way trip only. So what's it for? Asked Rocket, still looking skeptical. Hazardous waste disposal. Command put it in just in case somebody came up with something too dangerous even to bury. Rocket's expression turned serious with a suddenness that Carol found genuinely alarming. Well, that's pretty goddamn lucky for all of us, she said, because it just so happens that's exactly what you've got in your house right now, Blackie. Something too dangerous to bury. Great. Get somebody to call up a map of this place so you and your guys can see how to get out here from the clinic. We'll get you armed. She hung up and went on to Ledbetter. What's your story? Gunner Gottman, right? Ledbetter nodded. He's in the brig right now, and we just had to knock him out again. The guy is in seriously bad shape. He needs a doctor. Where the fuck is everybody? Good question, Carol said. Can you keep him sedated for a while, or do you think he might check out if he's down too long? No, he's all right that way. He's not going to die or anything. But he's so seriously bughouse he could kill somebody if he gets loose. Okay. Keep him knocked out till further notice. Leave 2 guys from your detail to watch him, and all the rest of you get back down here 5 minutes ago. We're in trouble. Ledbetter hung up by the way of saying, Yes, Sarge, and she went on to the 2 interns whom she could see had finally settled down and stopped talking. Okay, she said, what's your story, and why aren't you telling it to Supreme Allah? Dr. Stein's got a monster stashed away in the isolation area, said the one named Zelda urgently. We need grunts, lots of grunts, and they should be armed. Somebody's got to hit the panic button so the military can come and evacuate us, put in the other one, Roz. She actually seemed to be the calmer of the two. I mean, that's what it is for, right? Carol hesitated. No doubt it was better that she didn't know. Otherwise, neither she nor Zelda would have been calm. But goddamn, sometimes it was hard to know how to talk around it and not sound like you were hiding something. Relax. I can put a call into command right now and tell them to evacuate you people, she said, which is exactly what I'm going to do right now. So there's nothing to worry about. The best thing for you to do is go back to your quarters, pack your things, and stand by to get the hell out of here, okay? No, it's more serious than that, Zelda insisted, leaning in towards the monitor. Dr. XXI found out all this stuff about this creature. It's actually from Earth, the original Earth, Earth 1. Remember that professor from New Harvard and how he and all his students got killed on a field trip? Carol put up a hand. You guys got patches. Both interns looked uneasy. Not exactly, said Roz. A doctor has to give them to us, but only if... Yeah, Carol said. Go find some. I don't care where or how. Patch yourselves up, then do like I told you. Pack your things and be ready to move when transport gets here. Okay? The interns opened their mouths to protest or maybe just to ask questions. Carol didn't know and didn't care. Hey, that's all, she told them, muting their sound again. If we got a problem bad enough that we got to evacuate civilians, then the installation's under martial law and I'm in charge. You do as I say or my guys will put you in the brig till it's time to go. And after you're out, you can be charged with obstruction, recklessly endangering the lives of others, mutiny, even murder if somebody dies. So shut up and do what I told you, okay? She disconnected without waiting for an answer, and, just as she did, a new thought suddenly popped into her mind. Where the hell are the rest of the scientists? Practically on cue, one of the blank windows on her screen lit up again, and she found herself looking at Ramirez Gold and XXI, with Kosi Fantut, Fatima Haddad O'Reilly, and Supreme Allah crowded around behind them. "Where the hell are you people?" XXI demanded. "We need grunts with weapons. There's a..." At that moment, every alarm in the installation went off at once. Chapter 21. The possibility of some kind of contamination had been a particularly serious matter for the military from the beginning. The very nature of the project meant the potential for disaster was not only greater than usual, but multifaceted as well. And on top of all of that, there was the worst of the worst-case scenarios, a contamination disaster in the guise of a successful result. It was entirely possible that the usual precautions, or even the far more painstaking than usual precautions, would fail to prevent a major disaster. This was not, after all, simply research and development. It was military research and development for war. The Super Soldier Project had not been initiated with the intention of curing the sick, feeding the hungry, or reducing the visible signs of aging. Something bad was supposed to happen, although only to an officially designated enemy, and only when command gave the order. Such criteria have absolutely nothing to do with the function of effectiveness, or either radioactive materials or nanomachines, or, for that matter, Jason Voorhees, although, unlike the other two, he had criteria of his own. He had been surprised when the nanos had first made their way over to the corpse beside him and begun their work. It was because of them that living humans were able to keep him subdued, and this enraged him almost as much as human life itself. He knew, in his wordless, unthinking, instinctive way, that the nanos would eventually counteract the force that paralyzed him. More than that, however, he knew they weren't doing it now. When he felt them shifting within him, it felt as if they were about to drain out of him, but only some of them left, while the ones that stayed manufactured more of themselves to make up the lack, which made him angry at first. Somehow what little thought he was capable of had worked out the simple idea that if the nanos left him, it would break the paralysis and he would be free to move and kill again. He remained unable to move, but he could tell that the new nanos were more resistant to the force that kept him motionless. He wouldn't be stuck for much longer. And meanwhile, the nanos that had left him went to work on the 3 dead bodies. He knew what they were doing, although naturally he didn't wonder why. In a way, he already understood that the mechanisms were simply doing what they had been created to do, which was also what his continuing paralysis had prevented him from doing. If Jason had been able to do what he had been created to do, that is, move around, kill, sustain a certain amount of damage, and then regenerate, the nanos might have confined themselves to his body. But having such a prolonged period of inactivity imposed on them by an outside force, a great deal of pressure had built up from their long, unfulfilled programming. Thus, the proximity of such a severely damaged organism in need of repair induced a condition of relentless purpose. Still unable to move their host, they found a way to move themselves instead and got busy. The materials available to them were not the same as those they had found to rebuild and improve the host, but making do and adapting were just 2 of the many rather inventive elements in their programming. Otherwise, they adhered as closely as they could to the template of the original host. The facial area was completely identical. But there were certain things that were not merely different, but absent altogether. In the end, the creature built from the 3 corpses would have been a respectable copy of the original, except for the fact that it was not the embodiment of anti-life, but simply dead meat. The nanos could make it move, kill, sustain a certain amount of damage, and then regenerate. But for all of that, there was no rage, no fury, no hatred, no merciless drive to wipe out live humans. It would wipe out live humans, thanks to the nanos. It just wouldn't care. Dr. Stein could probably have got around that particular little drawback with a few biochemical switches and a little judicious programming, so that the reanimated dead meat unit behaved as if it cared. Short of a miraculous revelation in that area of metaphysics or mysticism, that was the best she would have been able to do, and it would have been good enough for the military. Unfortunately, she never had a chance to consider what results she could hope to achieve. She found herself between two extremely strong and dangerous creatures, each of them gripping her arm so tightly that she had no feeling in either of them. Even when the bone above her right elbow finally broke, she didn't really feel anything beyond the suddenness of its snapping and the way the flesh around it vibrated in response. Or maybe she actually had felt pain, so sharp and intense that she had more or less blacked out on her feet, or whited out, as if she were lost in a blizzard. Because all at once she looked up to see the creatures were no longer lying down but standing on either side of her. Their identical masked faces stared down at her, impassive but horrible, expressionless but hateful, and she knew what was going to happen. Nonetheless, for 1 second, or maybe even a little longer, she was actually hoping as she gazed up at them. She was hoping even as her right hand found the tablet in her lab coat pockets. Perhaps hoping had made her fingers steady, even nimble. She flipped open the panel on the back of the tablet and found the panic button. Hers was the only tablet so equipped. She had insisted that hers should be the only tablet with an onboard panic button, specifically because she had been unable to imagine any situation in which she would actually use it. Another unexpected development. 2 in the same day, and both of them major events. Life was full of surprises. The panic button was not the emergency lever meant to call in the rescue team. That's the civilian staff. And perhaps even a few of the more naive and inexperienced grunts thought it was. It was a true panic button. Not an SOS, but AIL, all is lost. As Master Sergeant Black Carroll had carefully avoided telling the 2 frightened interns, the military's response to a signal from the panic button was not to send out rescue teams and medical aid. However, it was to dispatch a squad of operatives who had been specially trained to secure the site of a catastrophe in such a way that it would be impossible for anything in the affected area to leak out or otherwise escape into the surrounding area. The definition of anything in this case including people. The team also made sure that nothing and no one could get in either. Ideally, the entire site, whatever it was, would be erased and neutralized, if not actually sterilized in some way. It was the best solution the military could come up with as a way of containing damage to an area as limited as possible. The only thing that would have been better would have been literal excision and expulsion, packing the affected area into a missile and launching it into space. Unfortunately, this was only possible for small-scale problems like an individual super soldier prototype. Command had yet to come up with a way to scoop up something as large as a secret installation that extended hundreds of feet underground or several square miles of countryside and shoot that into space. They did, however, have a team of experts working on it. Dr. Stein had never concerned herself with the problem of keeping a disaster contained. People only got what they asked for. They were only too eager to benefit from successful research and development. Therefore, they just had to deal with the consequences of failure as well. And if people chose not to think about potential risk, what did that have to do with her? She was a scientist, not a dictator. She wasn't in the business of telling people what to think about. Her reaching for the panic button now had nothing to do with any desire to protect the outside world from either possible contamination or the monsters who were about to bring her project to an abrupt and premature end. She simply could not bear the idea of leaving behind all of her hard work so that some other far less worthy individual could succeed with it. No fifth-rate mind with a doctorate for some vocational college in Lower Armpit was going to take the credit for her accomplishments, not if she could help it. The broken bone in her arm felt as if it were cycling rapidly between white-hot and absolute zero, but she managed to smile up at each of the monsters with satisfaction. The masked faces stared back at her, unchanged, and in spite of everything, especially herself, she felt another surge of hope begin in the pit of her stomach. Perhaps they sensed it too, or perhaps it simply showed in her face, or perhaps it was nothing except one more moment in time that just happened to be her last. Her finger pressed hard on the panic button, even as her arms tore out of their sockets, and a screaming firestorm erupted along the lengths of her body. Make a wish, she thought in a fleeting moment of utter composure, just before she sank into an agony that was far beyond a pale, tiny word like pain. It seemed like it took centuries before she finally passed all the way through it, into the darkness waiting on the other side. Of course, there had been no wishes made at the critical moment. Even if Dr. Stein had actually been able to speak her final words aloud rather than just thinking them, the gallows humor of her parting shot would have gone unappreciated. Had Jason Voorhees understood it, however, it would have enraged him even more, spurring him on to further violence. But since Dr. Stein was well beyond a point where such a thing would have made any difference to her, Jason's further violence would also have gone unappreciated. As the situation stood, it was nothing less than quintessentially existential. The fact that there was no one to appreciate or even to acknowledge its nature also made it perfect. Then Jason Voorhees held up his portion of Dr. Stein's horrifically untidy remains, and time, which seemed to have stopped somehow, began to move forward again. Jason took a long look at one side before he switched hands to study what he held from a different angle. What little amount of brain he had in his skull produced a small, dim notion to the effect that there really wasn't much substance to live humans. They ignited such furious hatred in him, and yet at the same time, they were ridiculously easy to kill. Even if Jason had had enough brain to wonder why, however, it was unlikely that he would have. Tossing the dead meat aside, he turned toward the door, intending to kick it down, and then stopped. He had all but forgotten there was another creature in the room, mostly because there was no good reason to remember. He hadn't needed any help to tear that disgusting live thing apart, so he had barely noticed that he had actually had some. Now the nanos in his body reminded him how the other creature had come into existence. But that was not what had caused him to come to a complete stop instead of punching his way out of the room. It was what the other creature was doing. Instead of dropping the wet mess of dead flesh and bone, the creature was pressing against its own body, mashing and rubbing the ragged, bloody pieces on itself as if it thought the material could be absorbed. Jason went on watching, while the nanos informed him wordlessly that the creature was right. What was left of the woman could be absorbed into its own body and used. In fact, the creature had to do this. It was composed of plain dead tissue that was not imbued with anti-life, and dead tissue did not last very long. It had to be replaced. When the last of the bloody fragments had disappeared into the creature's body, it raised its head alertly and then immediately went for the portion that Jason had discarded. Jason followed with his eyes, watching as nanos made the areas of its body seem to ripple and heave and erupt suddenly here and there with a cluster of worn shapes, things that grabbed and flowed into each other again as the new material was taken in. Then he looked down at himself. The nanos inside him had done the same thing for him with the ammunition the humans had fired at him before he had been captured, immobilized, and given over to that woman, so she could torture him for her own amusement. The extra material had made him stronger, yes, but in the end, his being stronger could not overcome the nanos' inherent weakness. In the long run, he would have been better off without them. He had never needed them before. The concept of trying to get rid of them, however, was beyond him. They were inside him. He would go on with them inside him. They would help fix and improve him as necessary. But he would not submit to their weaknesses anymore. Allowing nanos to incorporate dead human meat into his body would not do him any good at all. He turned away from the dead thing, still scrubbing scraps of flesh against itself, and kicked the door out of the frame and into the hallway. Stepping out, he looked one way and then the other, mildly surprised to find no humans coming at him with weapons, the way they usually did in hallways. Not that it mattered, although he was actually tired of always finding himself in one of these stupid hallways. Didn't any of them go outside anymore? He turned left, obeying a vague sense that said he would come to elevators or stairs, which would allow him to get around this place and find some live humans to kill. After which he could find his way out and find some more live humans to kill after that. It was an especially long hallway, and there was another door to kick down before the end of it. Only after he got through the second door did he finally notice the continuous screaming and ringing and buzzing of alarms. He reached a bank of elevators to find one of them already waiting for him with its doors open, almost as if it really was there for him, or for those things inside of him. Something in his awareness told him that this was, in fact, exactly right. That was also those things inside of him telling him things that he had never had to care about before. Jason stepped into the elevator and waited as it performed its functions. Just as it started to ascend, however, he felt a sudden and extremely powerful shock. both physical and yet at the same time completely intangible. It made him lift his hand and reach out to press one of the buttons on the elevator, and then told him where to go when the elevator stopped. It was the first time since he had joined the military that Dan Newman actually felt stupid. He couldn't really remember the last time he had felt that way, but it had probably been back in high school, and that didn't count. For the most part, he had never suffered from low self-esteem. Not being the sharpest knife in the drawer wasn't the worst thing to be, or not to be. He had found the ways in which he was capable and competent, so he didn't have to feel bad about what he wasn't. The Sarge having to tell him to patch himself up, though, that hadn't made him feel too capable or competent at all. Who the hell had to be told to do that? And it was a goddamn good thing the patch had kicked in before all bughouse hell had broken loose the way it did with the sirens and all that shit. God only knew what that would have done to him while he was too stupid to even think of how to take care of himself. He looked down at the clone of his sister in the vat and then at Omar Wing, who was hunched over on a stool at the far end of the lab with his back to him. Looked like the guy hadn't moved a muscle since planting himself there. Wouldn't turn around, wouldn't talk, or at least he hadn't said anything loud enough to be heard over the alarms. Maybe he should just go on over to the man, patch him up and get his ass out of here so he could meet up with the rest of the scientists wherever they were. Probably all heading for the nearest escape hatch. That was what he'd have done if he'd been one of them and he'd just found out somebody had pressed the panic button. It occurred to him suddenly that the scientists might not know exactly what was supposed to happen if somebody hit the panic button. None of them were military, after all. And if no one had thought to tell them about the panic button protocol, then there was no way they could know, could they? Nah, he probably had it all wrong. They weren't just a bunch of average civilians. They were scientists, and they knew this was a military project. So they had to know how everything worked, didn't they? Not necessarily, he thought, glazing at Omar Wing's hunched-over form. It was a sure bet that Dr. Stein knew just because she was the head of the project. But she'd have kept it all need to know for the rest of them, interns and scientists alike. And this was something she'd have figured none of them needed to know because she wasn't very nice. "Dr. Wing," he called, but he was barely able to hear his own voice over the din. As if on cue, most of the alarms cut off then, and the sudden quiet was startling enough to make him jump. But Wing still did not move a muscle. "Dr. Wing," Newman said again, taking a few steps towards him, "I have to get you out of here right now. All those alarms and shit, that means somebody somewhere hit the panic button. And that means this project here is officially over. Command will already have a team on the way to close the place down, and all civilian personnel are supposed to be gone by the time they get here. Even you, sir." He saw the man stiffen slightly. "Get away from me," he growled in an odd, ragged voice like something was twisting his throat, strangling him while he was talking. "I'm sorry, Dr. Wing. I've got to get you out of here. It's not safe to stay here anymore. That team that's coming out, they've got orders to seal this place up no matter what. And if you're still in here, they won't wait for you to get out. In fact, when they get here, they won't bother asking if there's anyone still inside. They'll just carry out their orders. They don't fool around when it's a panic button. Now, you can file a complaint and if you want to. You can even blame me for whatever you don't like. But you can't do that if they seal you up in here." Wing bent lower, pulling one shoulder forward and then the other, as if he were trying to drag himself free of something without having to move. "Dr. Wing, I'm not fooling around neither. I've been patient with you because I know you're all upset. I'm real upset about Linda. Get away from me!" Newman inadvertently took a step back in surprise. The man barely had a human voice at all now. What the fuck? What Wing had told him came flooding back then. Gottman shoving something in his face, broken glass, the blood but no cuts in his skin. "Oh, shit," Newman had said fillingly. "Okay, I get it now. Dr. Gottman contaminated you. I'm sorry, Dr. Wing, I didn't understand. But that's okay. This lab's got quarantine suits in the emergency locker. You just put one of those on and then you can get out of here." He cut off as Wing straightened up and got off the stool. Somehow the man had actually grown bigger while he'd been sitting there. And Newman just hadn't been able to see it because of the way he was hunched over. But he could sure see it now. The scientist was bigger and wider, and he was still getting bigger and wider. Newman took another couple steps back, thinking that he really ought to call for backup. Backup and 2 or 3 doctors and all the nurses from the clinic. Wing turned around to face him, and he heard himself yell something like, "Jesus Christ on a cracker!" It was an expression that used to drive Linda crazy when they were kids. There was some kind of metallic shell forming on Wing's face, or possibly in it. Newman couldn't actually tell whether it was covering the skin, or whether nanos were transforming the skin into a different substance altogether. His body was definitely morphing, clothes and all, and it looked to Newman like everything was getting mixed together somehow. Flesh and cloth and other stuff as well. "Ah, geez, Dr. Wing, you should have said," Newman hesitated, wincing. "Well, you should have said you felt, He gestured at the man's body. "You know, not too good?" He backed off another few steps. There might have been a couple of quarantine suits in the barracks that would have fit him, Newman thought, but probably not for long. Wing was actually swelling up bigger right in front of his eyes. "I gotta ask the Sarge what to do about this," he said uneasily as Wing took a step toward him. "There's special equipment and stuff." Wing took another step toward him, and then another, his big hands flexing, opening and closing. Newman tried to think of something to say, and then just hit the emergency call button on his belt. The call was silent. It would just go straight through to the Sarge and security, and let them know where he was and that he needed help. No noise, so it shouldn't have provoked Dr. Wing or stampeded him in any way. But either Wing had some idea of what he had just done, or it all just became too much for him right at the same moment, because suddenly he lunged forward, and then Newman found himself looking down from the discomfort of the man's two-handed grip around his neck, his feet dangling several feet above the floor. He looked like that creature, Newman thought in amazement, pulling futilely at Wing's hands and trying not to black out. He looks like that creature because he's turning into that creature. "Dr. Wing," he rasped, kicking his legs now. "Please, you don't have to." But Wing's face was completely gone now. Covered up or changed, or maybe a little of both. It didn't matter. With his face gone, there was no way to tell if Wing understood anything he was saying, or was too bughouse to even know who he was anymore. "Please," he begged faintly. "Please, sir." Not until he had looked at his reflection in the tray Newman had brought him had he realized he was in trouble. Then he had felt a tingling where the cuts in his face should have been. Just a psychosomatic reaction, no doubt, but goddamn was that ever moot right now. The same as how he had stood there feeling his face like some idiot who thought it was possible to feel where nanos were. Fucking nanos. Fucking nanos in those fucking cells. It had never occurred to him that those fucking cells had been full of fucking nanos. Those fucking impossible cells had been loaded with fucking nanos, and never once had it ever crossed his mind that was moot right now, too. Even though he could have found out in only a couple of seconds what the goddamn cells were carrying. Even first-year undergrads knew that unless there was perceptible activity, you had to test for the presence of nanos in a specific way because they just didn't show up otherwise. If they were inactive, they were inert, except in live vertebrates. Organic life couldn't tolerate a large concentration of nanos over an extended period of time. Humans especially had a low threshold for internal nanos, as if organic life and nanos were the antithesis of each other in some way. Only here he was, full of them, full of those cells and full of nanos, and no, it wasn't possible to feel nanos just by touching them, but you could feel the process if it was extensive enough, and this sure was. He was full of cells and full of nanos. Could he feel the process? Oh, could he feel the process? Processes, plural. All at once they were in every part of his body. The cells, the nanos, blooming everywhere inside him, taking over. They were consuming his body while his body consumed them. And it was almost finished. So all that was moot now, too. Everything was moot now. Now was moot now, because even time itself had changed. Disorientation took him like a tidal wave, and he thought he was losing consciousness, falling into some kind of turbulent darkness. And then suddenly, he had opened his eyes to see himself holding Dan Newman high in the air by his neck, as if he had intended to watch the soldier slowly strangled to death. His mind started to sink into darkness again, and as it did, he could feel something else moving in to take its place. It didn't make any sense, but there wasn't any other way he could articulate it to himself. He had no idea what it was, but he hated it instantly, hated it and feared it, and wanted to wipe it out. He fought to stay conscious, to stay awake and aware, refusing to give away to the other thing, whatever it was. If he let it supplant him, he knew that he would never come out of the darkness again. "Dr. Wing!" the soldier strained. His face was horribly red and his legs were kicking more frantically. There was something he should do, he thought, keeping his gaze fixed on the man he was strangling. Something he really had to do. But as soon as he tried to think of what it was, he could feel his mind begin to fade and his dominance weaken. He couldn't let that happen. He couldn't lose his hold to that other thing. And then all at once the other thing was not only inside of him fighting for control, but also standing in the open doorway of the cloning lab. The enemy inside him surged. Chapter 22. There was no question in Sophira's mind that Carol was in command. As far as she was concerned, this was one of those situations where rank had to take a back seat to the prevailing conditions. She'd been unconscious for 2 weeks, and although she was awake again and fit for action, she didn't even know where the hell she was. And even after Carol told her, she was having a hard time believing it. That was a waste of time under the circumstances. Instead, she gave herself over to her training. Act now, believe later. She had gotten her people to the barracks, arriving just before every alarm on the planet went off. Boy, had that been a bitch. If Carol hadn't cut them off, she was sure her ears would have started bleeding. Carol had already sent a detail to escort the scientist out of the installation, making sure that only the scientists left, and then dispatched a second group to isolation to seal it off manually. "Just try and make sure that whatever kind of trouble started there stays there instead of hitching a ride out of town with us," she had told Sophia while they broke out the extra weapons. There had been no shortage of weapons, even for an unexpected couple of dozen of extra grunts. Clothing, however, that had been a different matter altogether. "You'll have to serve in clinic pajamas," Carol had informed her. "But it could be worse. You could have woken up to find yourselves in full body condoms or nothing at all." Then she had turned to Sophia and started to say something about strategy when the emergency call had come in from the grunt in the cloning lab. Sophia's first thought on seeing the creature on the monitor in the surveillance area was to wonder what the hell had happened to it. It looked like a genuine old-school homunculus that Victor Frankenstein himself had glued together with his own 2 hands, using whatever he had found within reach. After which he'd painted the whole thing with varnish, or glaze maybe, thinking he was going to fire it in a kiln. Irregular, smeary patches of what looked like clothing and flesh ran up and down the thing's legs. The torso was particularly covered with some kind of hard, rubbery stuff. If she hadn't recognized the mask, Sophia thought, she'd have sworn that someone had actually made a second monster. Then Carol had pointed to a separate monitor getting a feed from a different part of the same lab, and she had just about jumped out of her skin. "God damn it, Carol," she said, turning to the other woman. "You got scientists making these fuckers?" "Those aren't fuckers," Black Carol said grimly. "They're super grunts." So Vera hit her own forehead with the heel of her hand. "Right. Jesus, I must have lost half my brain somewhere. Otherwise, I would have realized as soon as I laid eyes on that big bastard. The legendary super soldier project, right?" Carol laughed with no humor. "You thought it was just a rumor, too." "Half the shit they tell us is a rumor. Nobody's ever sure which half, though. Not even command." Sophia shrugged. "But I should have known. We all should have realized as soon as we saw it. Who the fuck let that thing get loose?" "That thing isn't from here," Carol said, pointing at the creature now entering the cloning lab. "That one came from you guys at the power station. And here I thought he was with you." Sophia looked down at the weapon she was holding. "Bad news, Carol. These don't work so well. You got any zap guns? How about thunderbolt rifles?" "Some, but not a whole lot. Stein didn't want us using them. Claim they generate random interference and screw up her precious nanos." "They do, which is why we need them. That's how we brought him down the first time." Carol looked at the monitors doubtfully. "Sure hope it works again." Me too, Sophia thought as they went back to the armory. There were nowhere near as many stun weapons as Sophia had hoped, and certainly not as many as there should have been. Carol decided Sophia's grunts should have them by virtue of previous experience, such as it was. But at least they were well kept and fully charged. Sophia thought this as they ran through a group weapons check. Then, as an afterthought, she grabbed several flame units. Chances were slim to none that any of those creatures would burn, but a face full of fire might slow them down a second or two. She started to ask Carol if there were any more of those lying around, but the other woman waved her off and pointed at the comm link in her left ear, mouthing, "Command." "Hope they're telling you something good," Sophia muttered. Judging from the look on the sergeant's face, however, it was anything but good. My mind is drowning in my head, Wing thought. It was a struggle just to look at the thing slowly making its way through the vat area of the cloning lab. His eyes felt strangely heavy, as if the act of seeing was almost too much of an extra burden. Nothing else seemed to be working right either. His body had become an oversized shell that didn't really belong to him anymore, and vice versa. He felt as if something, some force, almost like a strong electromagnetic field, was in the process of pushing him out or extinguishing him. It should have been a ridiculous, delusional kind of notion, but he sensed the presence of the interloper as solidly as if it were something outside of his body that he could touch to prove its existence to himself. Which it was. He had to fight to use his own eyes to see it standing there in front of him, but it was there. Its proximity stimulated and agitated the force that was battling to supplant him in a way that felt like a primitive, even animal familiar, or recognition thereof. Understanding flared in him then, but it didn't make it any easier to hold his own against the power that was trying to eradicate him. Those cells were from this thing, the cells that I put in the vat, that Gunner infected me with. I am like this thing. I am of this thing. I will become this thing. He made his hands open. He was vaguely aware that whatever he had been holding had dropped to the floor, but he didn't try to look at it, although he had a dim idea that he should have. If he had been in control, he would have done, but there was no way to be sure that the force inside him would not overwhelm him. The creature standing in front of him turned its impassive, merciless, still face towards the motionless human lying in a heap nearby. It stared for a long moment, then lifted its inhuman head and looked directly into his eyes. Shock was a pale word for the sensation that Wing felt, not only in the traitor body but in everything he was. Thoughts, memories, perceptions, what he knew, what he believed he knew, even what he didn't know. He felt as if he had been struck, but not touched, shattered without being fragmented. This must be what a tuning fork feels when it resonates with something, he thought, in some faraway, almost detached area of his compressed self, or what happens to a compass needle when it finds true north. All at once, everything there was to know about Jason Voorhees, now resident in his own body, became perceptible to him in a single, revelatory burst. Then the moment passed, and he was surprised to find that he, Omar Wing, was still in existence. He shouldn't have been, he thought. That moment had been a big bang. It should have snuffed out the last remaining spark of humanity and replaced it with anti-life. And yet here he was, still holding on, in an infection that refused to go away. But how? The force that had taken over and changed the body was obviously many times stronger than he was. And this creature, this Jason Voorhees, somehow reinforced it so that it should have become that much stronger. Omar Wing should have gone out like a guttering candle. He should have evaporated, dissipated, ceased to be, not only in body but also in soul. Why hadn't he? The answer came to him wordlessly, in a series of sensations he vaguely associated with rapidly changing chemical states or energy levels, which was perhaps the closest thing he had to a vocabulary that could express the nature of being alive. He didn't understand it, but at the same time he didn't have to. He was still in existence because he refused to be erased, and he would remain in existence for as long as he continued to refuse. That wouldn't be for much longer, though, Wing thought. He was weakening steadily, while the force inside of the body showed no sign of fading in the slightest. All it had to do was wait for him to wear out. He actually felt Jason Voorhees' rage increase, and he tried to brace himself, thinking the creature was going to physically attack him and wear him out that way. But Jason was turning toward the doorway, and Wing felt his body turning with him. Standing side by side, they watched the soldiers pouring into the lab through the open door. Lynn had been briefly flattered when Sophia had tossed her and Fredo full-size weapons rather than sidearms, and ordered them to evacuate the civilians. But she knew better than to let it go to her head. She had tried to tell both Sophia and the sergeant that at least one grunt should go with them, just to verify this was an official order. But neither woman was having any, and when she saw the barrel of Sophia's weapon moving in her general direction, she shut up and left in a hurry. Her apprehension would not lessen, though, especially when Fredo insisted on using the elevators instead of the stairs. It was perfectly safe, he told her. The installation wasn't burning down, the power wasn't going to fail. How the hell did he know, she wondered, and stairs wasted time and energy. Reluctantly, she let him herd her into a lift, but when the doors closed and it began to ascend, she suddenly found herself in the grip of genuine full-blown panic attack. 5 seconds later, she found herself calmly wiping the tears away with the back of her hand, while her breathing returned to normal. "I know I'm supposed to thank you," she said to Fredo, looking down at the patch he had slapped on her forearm. "But this kind of thing can't really be good for people. I mean, every time you feel something unpleasant, you just, I don't know, take an antidote?" "Argue with me after we get out of here," Fredo said irritably. "But between now and then, try not to go bughouse again. If things get really bad, there might not be enough for everybody." "You think we're going to have to use those?" she asked. He shrugged. She was relieved to find all the interns with the scientists and the clinic nurses in Kosti Fantoot's office. The only one missing was Gunnar Gottman. It was Fredo's opinion that he had already been evacuated by the soldiers guarding the brig and was, at this very moment, sprawled on his back somewhere on the well-kept grass outside the installation in blissful, sedated stupor. In any case, he certainly wasn't going to go looking for him. Lynn made a note to call Carol and ask her about Gottman. In the meantime, everyone was in favor of evacuating the installation as soon as possible, even those who hadn't had an opportunity to return to their quarters and grab a few personal things. Perhaps they'd already had a healthy supply of patches lying around in the office, Lynn thought. Waiting at the doors, Fredo led them all out. He had wanted her to go first, but she had had to remind him that she didn't know her way around as well as he did, so it made more sense for her to cover them from the rear. For a moment, he seemed inclined to argue with her, and then, much to her relief, changed his mind. Lynn knew that he probably thought her notion of covering the group from the rear was overdramatic, even silly, considering the grunts had both hostile creatures cornered in the cloning lab. But that was only because he hadn't seen what she had seen at the power station. Her heart gave a small, frightened leap at the memory. Barely a second later, she felt the patch on her arm release a little more chemical calm into her system. The stuff didn't let up for a second, she marveled. The military must have used industrial-strength dosages. Either that, or having it on her left arm, made that much difference in how quickly it worked. The hell with it, she told herself suddenly, marching along behind Roz and Devon. Getting out of yet another disaster alive was nothing to complain about, and the power station had been a rougher ride, a whole lot rougher. All things considered, she probably owed fate a thank you note. Then somebody up near the front of the group screamed, and Fredo was hollering for her in absolute terror. "It's almost deja vu," Lynn said, unaware that she had spoken aloud. "Shut up and help me kill the thing," Fredo said, hefting his weapon. The thing in question was standing between them and an elevator, waiting with the doors open, the way the original creature had confronted the group she had been with in the power station. But it hadn't waited very long before it had attacked. It had killed everyone except her, and it would have killed her too, if Sophia hadn't been there too. "Oh God," she thought, "don't tell me I've got to take off my shirt this time." But the thing standing in front of them didn't move. It didn't lunge forward, didn't back away. Didn't do anything at all, for which Lynn was hugely grateful. She didn't really want to see it, period, but she especially did not want to see it moving around. This wasn't the creature she had first seen at the power station. This was something else. Something that she thought might be, in its own way, a whole lot worse. There was one similarity. The metallic covering that served as its face seemed to be virtually identical to the original creature's. But the rest of it? The rest of it was moving, she realized suddenly, feeling her gorge rise. Not all at once, she saw after a moment, but in parts, which was what the creature seemed to be made out of. Spare parts. Odds and ends. Only they seemed to have grown onto, or into, or out of the thing, like tumors. except some of the tumors seemed to be made out of standard military-issue uniforms. That would have been bad enough, but then suddenly a mouth formed on the impassive metal face. "Well, this is an unexpected development," it said in Dr. Stein's voice. "I was starting to think that there was nothing else to eat around here but grunt." Lynn was completely unaware that both she and Fredo were screaming at the top of their lungs as they opened fire onto the thing. This one was nowhere near as strong or as indestructible, she saw. It staggered back under the force of the impact from their weapons, and whole chunks of flesh or something blew off, splattering the walls and the floor. Even so, it still wouldn't just fall down and die. Of course, Lynn thought, as she and Fredo drove it backward toward the elevator. It was nothing but a cheap copy of a real monster, an inferior knockoff that leaked blood and rotting tissue, but they still couldn't kill it. What kind of a fucking universe is this? Lynn thought furiously, trying to will the thing to fall apart at least. Finally, she and Fredo managed to force it all the way into the elevator, where it fetched up against the back wall. "The neck! Aim for the neck!" Fredo yelled, firing madly. "Brilliant!" she screamed back at him, doing as she was told. A few seconds later, the creature's head toppled forward and landed on the floor with a sickening wet thud. Lynn and Fredo jumped back as the body crumpled in a heap on top of it, just managing to avoid some splatter. All at once, the silence seemed to roar in Lynn's ears. She turned around to see the scientist and intern still frozen in horrified disbelief, staring at the mess in the elevator. "Yeah, me too," she said silently. There was another very brief burst of weapons fire behind her, and she whirled, raising her own weapon, and saw Fredo getting out of the elevator, being careful to avoid stepping on any bad monster remnants. He had shot out the control panel. "Well, all right," she heard herself say in a slightly shaky little voice. "I guess we'll have to wait for another one." Fredo frowned at her and shook his head. "Nah, you were right. We ought to take the stairs." "And we better take them at a run," said Ramirez Gold suddenly, pointing at something on the floor to her left. "Look!" Lynn was horrified to see that a chunk of unidentifiable tissue had actually began to writhe its movements, weak at first but obviously gaining strength. "This way! Really, really fast! Now!" Fredo hollered, albeit somewhat needlessly. Over half the group was ahead of him before he finished getting the words out. Chapter 23. Kinship was something that living humans felt for other living humans. Jason wouldn't have felt anything like that if he had been human, and the concept did not exist in the realm of anti-life. Besides, the copy of himself, this caricature, was fatally flawed. There was a spark of life in it that would not go out. The thing to do was reach over, grab the copy, and rip and tear until the spark went out. He started to do just that, but the nanos stopped him. They wanted him to let the spark just go out by itself, without damaging the other one. He tried moving toward the humans instead, and found his movement in that direction completely unhindered. They surprised him by trying to shoot him with power again, instead of the usual ammunition. Not that it mattered. The crackling force that had scrambled the little machines inside of him and rendered him immobile no longer had any effect on him. The little machines had realigned themselves, and the forces that made them go, they existed at a different frequency, a different resonance, and it was not one that humans could have tuned into very easily. He waded into the soldiers, firing their useless weapons, reached out and helped himself to their very breakable bodies, crushed the meat, twisted the bones, pulled pieces off some, and used them to beat down others. If he had been even remotely like a human, he might have wondered at how easy it was to kill them all, but he wasn't. Between the surging fury of anti-life and the little machines working away inside of him, he barely noticed when one of the humans sprayed him with fire. Omar Wing found the urge to join Jason Voorhees in the carnage almost irresistible. His inside seemed to be boiling with it. Once or twice he started to move forward and barely managed to stop himself. What he had to do was stop Jason Voorhees. He had to stop the killing. Except he knew that if he let himself move, it wouldn't be to stop him, but to join in. He was weakening even more. The sight of all that death, the blood, the pain, the screams was crushing the last bit of life out of him. And yet he couldn't look away. If he turned from the sight, he would lose his hold, and then he would be gone. Something touched his leg. He turned sharply and saw the human he had been holding high in the air by his neck. "Dr. Wing," the soldier said in a barely audible rasp. "Can't you help?" He had a fleeting sensation of weightlessness. Then he woke up. There was no reason for it. Like everything else that had happened, it didn't make any sense. But he wasn't going to waste any time thinking about sense. Somehow things had flipped, and he was suddenly the dominant force in this mutant traitor body. That was all he had to think about, and he didn't think about it for long. He strode across the room, refusing to look down at what was under his feet, found his way through the weapons, and the wounded, and the dead, batted away the few humans, and finally took hold of the one he resonated with, and who resonated with him. Then, without really knowing how he was doing it, he told the nanos inside both of them what he wanted. There was a flash that Wing felt rather than saw, and Jason Voorhees suddenly crashed to the floor, paralyzed. Wing rolled him over onto his back, intending to pick him up, and then paused. The monster's eyes seemed to burn as they looked directly into his. The paralysis wouldn't last indefinitely. He could tell that Jason knew it as well as he did. "Just last long enough," he begged silently. "Long enough for me to get to where I need to go." Dan Newman wasn't sure if he would ever be able to talk normally again. His windpipe felt as if it had been bent in half, and he didn't have to look in the bottom of a metal tray to know his neck was black and blue. And he had no idea why Omar Wing had been ready to kill him one minute and suddenly turn rescuer the next. For that matter, he couldn't have said what had made him think the man would turn rescuer after nearly choking him to death. "Maybe it's just that I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer," he thought as he hurried after Omar Wing. "I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer, and I'm all patched up, so I'd probably do just about anything, like chase after a couple of monsters." He hadn't understood right away where Wing was going with Dr. Stein's erstwhile favorite thrown over one big shoulder, and apparently Wing was even less able to talk than he was, so it was no use asking him. But Carol and the other grunts from the clinic, the few who hadn't been literally torn apart, had known that Wing was heading for the Launchpad. Up until then, he hadn't realized that the scientists all knew about the Launchpad too. But he supposed that only made sense. After all, if anyone at the installation produced something they had to get rid of as completely and quickly as possible, it would be the scientist. So they'd have to have had known what to do, and fast. It wasn't far from the cloning lab to the Launchpad, and the Launchpad itself was pretty compact. You didn't really need a whole lot of room to basically fire a missile you didn't plan ever on recovering. The silo was built into a corner of the installation, and that was pretty much all there was to it, a silo and a control room. And the blast area lower down you had to stay away from. They had just reached the entrance to the control room when every alarm in the place went off again. The creature still draped over his shoulder, Omar Wing stopped and turned to him, and then to Black Carol and her friend, the one from the clinic that she called Rocket. "The crew from command is here," Carol told them. "Let's get this done as quickly as possible." She was definitely going to get court-martialed for this, Carol thought as she ran through the pre-launch routine in the control room with Sophia. So much for her future as an assassin. When the military got through with her, she'd be lucky to land a job as an exterminator. Beside her, Sophia leaned over and gave her a nudge. "What is it? You look like somebody shot your dog, or did your dog shoot you?" "The bitch," Carol gave her a sidelong glance. "I'm fucked is what this is. When command finds out I shot that thing into space, they're going to draw and quarter my ass and feed it to the pigs for breakfast." "What are you talking about?" Sophia asked. "They're going to seal this place up." Carol shook her head. "No, they're not. I got a message from them earlier. They had a tap on our surveillance system, plus a few extras of their own. They know everything that happened, everything Stein did." She paused to turn on the half-dozen monitors on the wall facing her, but for some reason they were slow to light up. They even had a few eyes we didn't know about in the isolation area. "Yeah?" Sophia leaned over and tried to help her with the monitor controls. "So?" "Well, they're not coming to seal up the place. They're bringing in replacement staff." She met Sophia's incredulous gaze with an unemotional stare. "Rocket, this project was meant to produce super soldiers. Command is not going to stop until they get them." The central monitor in the top row lit up to show them the payload. The hatch was still shut. "Can we open that from here?" Sophia asked. Carol nodded and touched a lighted panel on the console. For a couple of very long seconds, nothing happened, and she was afraid that Command's team had already managed to put in some kind of lockdown. But then the hatch shifted a bit as the seal released and began to open slowly inward. Carol winced. Damn, just their luck that the payload opened inward. It might give Wing some trouble shutting it again. Fuck it. She would launch it with the hatch open if she had to. It would close automatically as soon as it hit the air anyway. She would just have to hope once Wing got the son of a bitch inside, he wouldn't get a chance to jump out. Sophia nudged her again and pointed at the last monitor on the right, which displayed a wide-angle view of the helipad 100 feet straight up from the highest level of the installation. 3 choppers had touched down, the third one only moments ago. A full load of passengers was disembarking from a side door under the brisk supervision of several armed guards. None of the new arrivals were in uniform, although Carol could tell just by the way they moved that they weren't military. She could also tell that they were all about as thrilled to be here as the original group had been when armed guards had herded them into the installation. The original group? Carol frowned. Dr. Stein and everyone else, Wing, Gold, Toot, and the others, Supreme Allah and the interns, hell, even herself and the grunts. Were they really the original group on this project, in this installation? Or had she just assumed that this place hadn't been sterilized and restaffed once before, simply because Command had chosen not to say otherwise? Dan Newman moved into view on the center monitor, beckoning to someone and then pushing the payload hatch rather inward. Wing appeared, still carrying the creature over one shoulder. Carol hit the comm button. "Hurry up, Dan," she said urgently. "We've got company." I know, Sarge," Newman replied, his voice filtered and woolly in the console speaker. He stopped to look around, as if he really thought he could see exactly where her voice was coming from. Wing pushed past him and bent over, dumping his burden on the floor of the walkway just outside the open hatch. "He's staggering," Sophia pointed out tensely. Wing was more than staggering. Carol saw him go down on one knee. Dan Newman went to him, put his hands on the big, thick shoulders briefly. Wing shook him off, seemed to hesitate, and then reached for the creature's feet. With an enormous effort, he heaved himself to a standing position and started to roll the monster over backwards into the payload. Abruptly, Jason Voorhees' hand shot out and grabbed hold of either side of the open hatch. Wing froze in obvious surprise. Jason kicked out with both legs and Wing let go, staggering backward several feet into Newman and knocking him down. He strained to regain his balance with an effort, seemed to be on the verge of righting himself, and then fell squarely on top of Newman. Before Carol could even react, the speakers in the console gave a loud crackle. "Attention, all personnel," said a male voice she didn't recognize. "Stand down immediately. Repeat, stand down immediately. You are relieved of duty. Take no further action, regardless of what you are doing, and hold your positions until further orders." Carol gave the ceiling a murderous glance, then leaned forward and hit the comm button for the launch pad again. "Wing, Newman, I don't know if you can hear me or understand me, but get that fucking thing off my planet right now." The ceiling speakers crackled again. "Belay that order," snapped the new voice. "Who is speaking? Identify yourself. All personnel are to stand down now. Freeze, because we will shoot you." "You heard the man," Carol said, keeping the comm open. "We're out of time. Get that fucker out of here. Sergeant Carroll, you are hereby relieved of duty and are under arrest. Hold your position and do not attempt to give any more orders or to escape. We will shoot you and anyone with you on sight." Sophia gave a grim laugh. "Motherfuckers, you gotta see us first, and that might be kinda hard." She got up and headed for the door, her sidearm already in her hand. "You do what you can with them, and I'll see how long I can hold off the friendly fire." Carol didn't try to argue. Countdown had to start now. She realized this, or the crew from command would have time to abort the launch. She hit a switch, and a panel directly in front of her slid back to reveal the keypad that would unlock the final launch controls. Quickly, she entered a string of numbers from memory and prayed that her training and full recall was still fresh enough. A small square screen to the left of the keypad lit up with a message. "Override protocol active. Pre-launch sequence terminated. 10 seconds to countdown as of now." Only the military would have a countdown to a countdown, Carol thought. 30 seconds to launch. On the monitor, Jason Voorhees was back up on his feet and moving towards Wing. Dan Newman wasn't sure whether he had actually heard his ribs crack, or whether the pain had taken over his ears. It sure had taken over his eyes. Now he knew what people meant when they described a pain as blinding. He was still mostly blind when Wing rolled off him, but he could feel the walkway shaking, and he had a pretty good idea why. He made a tentative start at trying to sit up, and his ribs screamed in protest. "Shut up," he ordered them silently as he groped around on either side for something to grab hold of. His right hand closed on a rounded metal object that he knew was part of the walkway railing. His ribs screamed again as he dragged himself closer to it, and he told them to shut up again. When his vision cleared, he saw he had a fairly good grip on the rail, but he wasn't close enough to grab it with his left hand without rolling onto his side, unless he tried reaching up instead of across, the angle at which he was lying at the moment. His ribs screamed some more as he stretched out his left arm. "Shut up!" he bellowed, and then froze for a moment, shocked at the sound of his own voice. A moment later, he was even more shocked to realize that his ribs were no longer inclined to scream even just a little bit. Newman jumped to his feet and looked down at himself, knowing it didn't matter that he couldn't see anything different about himself. How long did he have, he wondered. Far below the walkway, he heard the sound of engines beginning to ignite. Inside Omar Wing, the dark was rising. He could feel it even more vividly than he felt the blows from that creature, or even the impact of his own fist against the thing. And it was pointless. They could have fought each other like this for 50 years to no effect whatsoever. Except he wasn't going to last 50 years. He was going to last another 50 seconds, and he knew it. All at once he became aware of a deep rumbling sound growing in volume, building into a roar. The walkway began to shudder violently, and he realized that with or without Jason Voorhees, the rocket was about to launch. The realization sent a surge of mindless panic through him like an electric current. Exactly like an electric current. He actually felt it tear through the traitor body, leap out and across over into Jason Voorhees. Abruptly, Wing let go of him, and Jason suddenly jerked backwards, with such force that his feet came up off the floor of the walkway. He actually flew backwards several feet and then caught himself on the open hatch again. Wing reached towards him, intending to use his last seconds as a human being to shove the monster in. Just as he reached out, Jason and everything in front of him disappeared in a strange burning cloud of gas. Carol had briefly slumped back in her chair when she found herself being yanked roughly out of it. A moment later, she found herself bent over the console while someone cuffed her hands behind her back. A strong hand pulled her upright again by the back of her shirt and turned her around. She was surprised to see that the control room was full of grunts. Damn, but she must have been in some hyperspace of the mind, she thought. Or maybe she had just gone crazy, in which case she might have a defense for her court-martial, assuming they bothered with the trial before they buried her alive. Her gaze fell on Sophia, who was also cuffed and in the custody of two very large guys that Carol was pretty sure were assassins and not grunts. So that was how it was, she thought grimly. Sophia caught her eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod. Great. "Team leader, this is Foreman D," said a man on her left. Carol turned to look. The standard military uniform didn't fool her. She knew for a fact that this guy was an assassin. He was one of the people she had talked to about applying. He flicked a glance in her direction, but very pointedly didn't turn to look directly at her. "Control room is secured, but the bird is flown. Repeat, subject has been launched and disposed of. However, 3 other working prototypes have been recovered. 1 from a disabled elevator and 2 from the Launchpad walkway." Carol felt her mouth drop open in amazement. "What?" she demanded. The assassin ignored her. "The prototypes recovered on the Launchpad have sustained damage from the rocket launch. 1 prototype was in the extremely early stages of transformation but should still be salvageable. The other is fully mature and shows signs of active regeneration in progress." "Dan Newman is a grunt, not a prototype," Carol shouted. Still not looking at her, the assassin made a small motion with one hand, and Carol found herself on her way out of the control room between 2 more assassins. "Sophia!" she called out as they hustled her down a long hallway. "Right behind you," came the answer. "No talking, children," said the guard on her right, and tightened his grip very briefly to a point somewhere between painful and excruciating. So that was it, Carol thought. No briefing, no debriefing, no explanation, no trial, and no chance for appeal. Maybe if she hadn't sent that thing into space, neither she nor Sophia would have been on the wrong side of the handcuffs. Then she caught herself. No, the only way she would have avoided that was to not have been here in the first place. The only mistake she had made in launching that creature into space was failing to find a way to send the people behind the Super Soldier Project with him. You weren't home free unless you got rid of all the monsters. If I can just keep that in mind, she told herself darkly, maybe next lifetime I'll do it right. Last call. For God's sake, Bowles, what the hell have you done now? Lynn switched the disposable phone from one ear to the other. Can't imagine what you mean by that, Waxy, she said, trying to keep her voice light. 2 days ago, a couple of very serious government goons showed up to inform me that you were missing and presumed dead after the military put down an attempted terrorist takeover of some government research project. Did they? She said faintly. Did they ever? Only I got the idea they're not really presuming you're dead, since they made it real clear that if by some miracle you appeared alive and well, I was to call them immediately and let them know. Furthermore, something tells me they don't count on the honor system, so they're probably listening in right now, which means that I'll be calling them to let them know you called me. I don't think they'd react well if I didn't. Glad I've got a disposable phone, Lynn said. I wouldn't count on that working for much longer, Waxy warned her. You're right. Love you, Waxy. Bye. She dropped the phone on the ground and stepped on it, mashing it into the pavement until there was nothing left but fragments and fragments of fragments. Then she walked over to the car, parked at the curb, and climbed into the front seat. Well, said Fredo, sitting behind the wheel. She looked from him to Zelda and Roz in the back. When did we cross the second border? About 2 hours ago, Fredo told her. I think we ought to cross at least another 2 before we buy any more disposable phones, she said. Or we could just give up disposable phones altogether, Fredo said and put the car in gear. I still wish we knew who else got away, Zelda said wistfully. Just be glad we know for sure that we got away, Roz told her. So far, added Lynn. Nobody else said anything for a very long time. Epilogue. The most ancient didn't normally bother with flotsam. Any vessel that wandered into range of their considerably sophisticated sensors had been adrift for an extremely long time. If there had been any live cargo to begin with, it would be well beyond the point of compassionate return. The most ancient had learned the hard way that as sad as it may be that living creatures had to die, it was usually wiser to let them stay dead. So whenever a spacecraft raised a blip on their awareness, they usually let it pass undisturbed until it was out of their range again. But this was different. The cargo inside was not alive, but it was no longer dead. That would have been strange enough by itself. But then one of the most ancient also determined that, though no fault of its own, it was temporarily dislocated. The entire most ancient continuum went immediately to crisis discussion, something that had not occurred for eons. Temporal dislocation just didn't happen. Only in this case it had. Something had slipped out of order, and the wrong course of events had been set in motion. This was further complicated by the fact that the not alive, not dead entity had continued not only to exist out of place, but also to act in such a way that it could not be temporarily relocated without invoking a disastrous and criminal contradiction. For a most ancient moment, a nanosecond by human reckoning, all seemed lost. But then the most ancient reviewed the case and understood that the solution was actually quite simple. If they could not temporarily relocate the entity, and they could not leave it alone, then there was only one course of action left to them. They did both. They had no idea at the time how unfortunate their decision would be for quite a number of living creatures, nor did any of them ever find out. The end. Okay, this has been the very long conclusion of Jason X, The Experiment by Pat Cadigan, which is also the direct sequel to Jason X, the movie. The reason I knocked the rest of it out today is, I got to be honest with you, I was really excited going into this book, And the first half of the book was like, wow, this is really a good Jason book. And then when it went from the power plant to the government facility, it's like Jason just spent the last half of the book immobile. And when he finally did get free, we were just told he killed a bunch of people. No description, nothing. It seemed more like the writer was more about just using as many big words as she could and stringing them together and making herself look intelligent. I mean, I get she was trying to go with this whole anti-life angle with Jason, but there was a lot lost in between. A lot lost in translation, I guess is the word. So really, I wasn't too pleased with the book as a whole, and I decided earlier today I'm just going to finish the book and move on to Friday the 13th Hell Lake. That'll be the book I start next. And I'm going to go ahead and do the alternating book thing. So there'll be 2 to 3 chapters of Friday the 13th Hell Lake tomorrow. And then on Saturday, there will be 2 to 3 chapters of A Nightmare on Elm Street Protégé. I hope everybody enjoyed this narration of Jason X the Experiment. Even if I didn't think the book was that great, some of you might have enjoyed it. I was suffering from kidney stones for a big portion of the narrations of Jason X the Experiment, so I'm sorry if my narration was lacking compared to the other 2 books. I promise going into the next couple books that I do, I'll be back to my normal self, and I hope that they won't be lacking narration-wise. I am actually going to give this book away. So all you have to do to win Jason X the Experiment is answer the following question in the comments below. What are the names of the sex maniacs? All you got to do is answer that in the comments, and 2 weeks from today, I will take all the correct answers and take the usernames of those who answered and do a drawing just like I did with the last book, and the winner will receive my only copy of Jason X the Experiment. I saw a copy of this book going online for like $180. But I don't want to sell my books. I don't want to price gouge fans. I want to share them on YouTube through narrations, and then a bunch of my books I want to be able to pass on to another super fan like me. So I'm not going for money. I want to give this book to one of you guys so you can enjoy it and have it for part of your book collection. So until next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening. See you in the next book.